Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to our YouTube channel. So, in this video, we are going to see what if Naruto was a primordial vampire and the ruler of the land of silence. So, yeah, this is gonna be very interesting video. So, watch till end. And if you want more, then please make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. So, yeah, without wasting any more time, let's jump right back into the video.
Let's begin with Chapter 1, The Night That Remembered Itself. Before the god tree, before the sage of 6 paths walked the earth preaching peace with wounds still fresh on his hands, before chakra had a name or a theology or a system of hand signs to make it obedient, there was the dark. Not darkness as humans understood it. Not the absence of light, not the space between stars, not the shadow a candle throws on a wall. Something older than all of those things, something that existed in the interval before the world decided what it was going to be. A silence so complete that even silence was too loud a word for it. It had no name. Names were a later invention, a convenience developed by creatures who needed to point at things. It simply was. And on the night of October 10th, when a red-haired woman screamed her last breath into a mountaintop sky, and a yellow-haired man wept over a ceiling scroll with hands that would not stop shaking, the dark opened one eye. The Kyuubi's assault on Konoha was, by any measure, the worst night in the village's history. The death toll climbed through the hundreds before the beast had been walking for an hour. Buildings that had stood for generations became rubble in seconds. The earth itself cracked under the weight of something that was not meant to exist at the scale it was existing. Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, understood by the time he reached the battlefield that there was no technique in the shinobi world capable of killing what stood before him. Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, the oldest and most powerful of the tailed beasts, was not a problem that could be solved with ninjutsu. It could only be relocated. The sealing ritual he had prepared, the one built on Kushina's own Jinchuriki chains and the summoning of the Shinigami itself, was a masterwork of Fuinjutsu that Minato had spent years developing in secret. It would split the fox's chakra, seal the yang half into his newborn son, deliver the yin half into the death god's stomach, beyond retrieval, beyond use, the cost, Minato's soul, his life. His presence in the world forfeit, he had made peace with this. What he had not planned for, what no amount of preparation could have planned for, was the 2-second window between the Shinigami's mouth opening and the first chakra extraction, when the ritual tore a microfracture in the fabric of what the world was made of. A crack so small that the sealing specialists who would later analyze the site found no evidence of it. A crack that lasted, by the best estimates a century of later scholarship would produce, approximately 0.3 of a second. Through that crack, something looked in. It did not force entry. It had no interest in force. Force was a concept developed by things that needed to overcome resistance, and nothing had ever been able to offer it resistance. It looked in, and in the center of the ritual, in the eye of the most powerful sealing technique of the modern era, it saw a soul. New, unconditioned, 3 minutes old and already having had the worst 3 minutes of anyone's life, the soul of Naruto Uzumaki, and the dark, ancient, patient, nameless recognized it, the way you recognize something you lost so long ago you forgot you lost it, the way a river recognizes the sea. Not with emotion, not with intent, not with anything that could be called a decision. Simply recognition. As automatic as breathing, as inevitable as gravity, the fracture closed, the seal completed. Minato fell. Naruto cried in the cold night air, fists clenching around nothing, unaware that something had just looked at him from the space between worlds and decided, quietly and permanently, that he was its. In the depths of the new seal, behind the enormous iron cage that housed a furious and terrified nine-tailed fox, a second room appeared. No door, no furnishings, just a space, absolute in its dark, that settled into the architecture of the seal the way a room that was always there settles into a house when someone finally notices it. Kurama pressed against his cage bars and stared at the second room. For the first time in 1,000 years, the nine-tailed fox was afraid. Naruto Uzumaki grew up badly. This was not a secret, not in Konoha, though it was a secret the village preferred not to examine directly. He grew up in an apartment that the village housing office assigned him out of legal obligation, smallest available unit, furthest from the village center, as though physical distance could quarantine whatever they imagined he carried. He grew up eating at Chuchai's ramen stand, because Chuchai was one of the 8 adults in Konoha who looked at the boy, and saw a boy rather than the thing sealed inside him. He grew up performing loudness the way other children performed quietness, as a survival strategy, as a way of taking up space in a world that kept trying to pretend he wasn't in it. He was extraordinarily good at pretending to be simple. He wasn't simple. He was very, very good at paying attention to a world that had taught him, from his first memories, that attention was the difference between surviving a day and not. There were things about himself that he noticed and did not mention to anyone. He never quite slept. He lay still in the dark of his apartment, and his body rested, but something behind his eyes remained awake, not anxiously, not in the way a child woke from nightmares, but the way a very old thing remains aware of its environment with no particular urgency. He would lie there in the dark and simply be aware, and the dark would feel, somehow, comfortable. Familiar. Like recognizing a language you don't remember learning, animals avoided him. Not the way animals avoided loud, aggressive children, not with startled flight or nervous retreat. They simply redirected. A dog walking toward him would smoothly curve its path before it registered a decision to do so. Birds on a fence line would lift and relocate before he reached them. Insects in his apartment's corners were absent. He noticed this by age 5 and spent a week feeling sorry about it, then stopped feeling sorry because feeling sorry didn't change it. He healed faster than he should have. Faster than even the Jinchuriki textbooks, which he was not supposed to have read but had read anyway, having broken into the academy library at age 8 with a lockpick made from a hairpin, described as normal for Kurama's influence. A deep cut closed in minutes. A broken bone straightened overnight, but there was something different about this healing compared to what the texts described. It left no marks, no scars, not healed over damage, forgotten damage, as if his body did not carry wounds forward into the future, as if the wound had happened to someone else. The third Hokage watched him during the academy years with something he could not name. There was depth behind the boy's eyes that the performance of cheerful idiocy did not entirely obscure, a stillness, visible in unguarded moments, that belonged to something much older than a child. Hiruzen Sarutobi had lived a very long life and seen many things. He did not know what he was seeing in Naruto's quiet moments, and so he did the human thing. He noted it, filed it in the section of his mind marked things to understand later, and focused on the problems that were immediate. Later never came for Hiruzen. The forbidden scroll was heavy and smelled of old chakra, the dense, layered scent of 100 sealing techniques preserved across generations. Naruto dragged it through the forest outside the village walls with the single-minded purpose of a boy who had been told he'd failed and couldn't accept it, who had been told there was a workaround and had grabbed at it with both hands. He unrolled it in a clearing and began to read. Shadow clone jutsu, straightforward enough in theory, catastrophically difficult in execution for someone with his chakra reserves. He began practicing. The paper cut happened in the second hour. A scroll edge, sharp and precise, across the pad of his right thumb. Blood welled up immediately, bright and immediate, and before he could wipe it on his pants it fell, one drop perfectly round onto the surface of the scroll. Onto the sealing script. The script did not glow. It did not pulse. It did not do anything visible. But in the second room beneath the seal, in the dark that had been quietly occupying the space between Kurama's cage and the seal's outer wall for 12 years, something shifted, the way a sleeping thing shifts when it feels the sun on its face. Not waking, not yet, but noticing. Naruto felt it as warmth in his sternum that was not warm, a pressure that was not pressure, a recognition from somewhere very deep that something had been touched. He pressed his thumb to his pants, looked at the smear of blood, and felt certain, with the certainty of a thing known rather than reasoned, that something had just changed. He didn't know what. He had a test to pass. He went back to practicing. By the time Uruka found him in the clearing, battered and exhausted and grinning with the specific pride of someone who had pulled off something impossible, Naruto had mastered a technique that was supposed to take weeks in a single night. He had no frame for understanding this. He filed it next to the healing and the sleeplessness and the animals, and the strange dark comfort of lying awake at 3 a.m. in his apartment. The second room's window was now open, not wide, just enough. The years accumulated. The Chunin exams, where Naruto stood on a tournament floor in front of a full crowd and refused, with his whole chest, to stay down. Where something in the crowd shifted, watching a kid who'd been discarded since birth stand in front of a prodigy who'd been groomed since birth, and simply declined to lose. The Valley of the End, where the most important friendship of his life fractured, and Naruto lay face down in the shallows of the river and felt the loss as a physical wound that Kurama's healing couldn't quite reach. Not because it was beyond healing, because it wasn't the body that had been hurt. Jiraiya. 3 years on the road with a man who was trying, in his clumsy, enormous-hearted way, to give Naruto the father-shaped thing that had been missing. Naruto, who absorbed this imperfectly because he had no template for it, who was grateful and awkward and prickly about it, who loved Jiraiya with the specific ferocity of someone who had never been allowed to love anyone before. The training worked. He got stronger. Demonstrably, dramatically stronger. His chakra reserves expanded past the point that Jiraiya had theoretical frameworks for. His control, once catastrophic, became precise. He developed techniques that shouldn't have been possible for someone his age and experience level and attributed it to hard work and stubbornness, which was true, but not complete. What was also true? The second room was growing, not dramatically, not visibly. The way a root system grows beneath a foundation, invisibly, with patience, with no interest in being noticed. The primordial connection beneath the seal was not adding power to Naruto the way Kurama's chakra added power. It was doing something different. It was becoming Naruto, slowly, the way water becomes the riverbed, not by force, but by the sustained, patient pressure of occupying the same space for long enough. Kurama felt it with the clarity of someone locked in a room watching water rise from the other side of the bars. The fox had spent 12 years considering Naruto a nuisance, a vessel, a child whose chakra he could flood when pushed. He spent the next 3 years reconsidering. Not the child, the space inside the child. The second room, the thing that occupied it. Kurama knew what it was, because Kurama was old enough to have known the world before Kaguya, before the god tree, before chakra. 9-tailed foxes lived long enough to carry memory across geological ages. And the presence growing beneath the seal in Naruto, the slow, cold, absolute certainty of it, was something Kurama recognized from the oldest layer of his memory. It was what had been here before everything, and it had chosen Naruto Uzumaki. And Kurama, the most powerful of the tailed beasts, sealed into a 16-year-old boy on a return trip home from 3 years of travel, pressed against his cage bars and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that whatever future Naruto had been pointed toward was no longer the future that was going to happen. Naruto stood at the gates of Konoha as the afternoon light made the village look exactly like it always had from this angle, warm and contained and full of people who were about to be surprised to see him. He had walked this road in his imagination 100 times during the 3 years away. He had scripted the return, the entrance, Sakura's reaction, Kakashi's measured approval, the ramen stand Chuchai, the particular comfort of a bowl that tasted like the only reliable warmth his childhood had contained. He stood at the gate and the script dissolved, not dramatically, not in a moment of dark revelation. It simply became clear to him, standing there with his travel pack over one shoulder and 3 years of growth in his body, that something in him had shifted in orientation without his awareness. The way you realize you've been walking in the wrong direction, not because anything looks wrong, but because the sense of correct has quietly relocated. Konoha was behind him. Something else was ahead. He stood at the gate for a long time. Long enough for the gate guards to notice him and exchange confused looks. Long enough for a civilian woman to stop and stare and then hurry past. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift into early evening. He was not deciding. Decision implied options. This was simpler than decision. This was a body understanding where its weight wanted to fall. Don't. Kurama's voice rising from the depths of the seal with an urgency the fox had never used before. Not rage, not contempt, desperation. Whatever is calling you, don't answer it. Naruto, listen to me, don't. Naruto had never heard Kurama sound like that. He stood with it for a moment, genuinely moved by it, the way a person is moved when they realize someone who never showed care for them has apparently been caring all along. It's not calling me, Kurama, he said, inside the seal where their communication happened. It's remembering me, that's worse, Kurama said. Naruto, that is so much worse, but Naruto had already turned from the gate. He walked, not with particular urgency, not with visible purpose. Just walked, the way water walks downhill, not because it has chosen to, but because the shape of the world makes it correct. By midnight, Konoha's lights were behind him. By dawn, he had crossed into country that the maps labeled as contested territory. By the third day, he was in land that the maps did not reliably label at all. The borderland approach to what the great nations had no particular reason to think about, the land of silence. He had never been here before. He had never had reason to come here before. He had never heard it described as anything other than a political inconvenience, too remote for efficient absorption, too hostile for profitable engagement. A nothing place where nobody went who didn't have to. He crossed the border and the air changed immediately, not temperature, not humidity. Something in the quality of the air's willingness to contain sound. It was quieter here. Not because the ambient noise of forest and wind was absent, but because the quiet went deeper, below the surface of the soundscape into something that felt, somehow, constitutional. As if this land had decided at a foundational level that silence was the correct condition, and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to figure this out. Naruto inhaled deeply. For the first time in his life, he felt his shoulders drop completely. Every muscle he had been holding against the world, the performance, the loudness, the perpetual forward lean of a boy trying to take up enough space that he couldn't be ignored, let go. All at once. Without a decision to release it, he exhaled. The second room in the seal opened fully. It was not a violent event. There was no surge of power, no dark energy flooding his chakra network, no physical transformation. It was quieter than that, quieter than anything. The primordial connection that had been growing beneath the seal since the night of his birth simply completed. The way a river that has been underground for 100 miles emerges into open air, not a new thing, just a thing that had finally reached its natural state. Naruto stood in the borderland of the land of silence and felt himself become, finally, what he had always been. His chakra, the vast, roiling ocean of yang chakra Kurama had spent years riding like a storm, went still. Not absent, still. The way a very deep body of water is still on the surface while the currents below do whatever they like. His chakra network, which every sensor ninja who had ever probed it described as overwhelming and chaotic, reorganized itself around something older. Something that occupied the center of him, and everything else organized around it, the way planets organize around a gravity source. Kurama, in his cage, felt the reorganization and made no sound. The fox sat down, curled his tails around himself, and for the first time in 12 years, the nine tails simply waited because there was nothing else to do. Naruto opened his eyes. They were the same eyes. Blue, the specific blue of a clear sky that carries no ambiguity about what it is. But behind them, for the person observing, if there had been a person observing, there was now depth. Not human depth, the depth of a well that has no bottom. The depth of a sky viewed from the inside of it, looking outward in all directions at once. He looked at the land of silence around him. The sky, perpetually overcast, the cloud cover so total that the sun was a rumor. The trees, dark-barked and growing at angles that suggested the soil beneath them was doing something unusual. The geological scars in the exposed rock faces at the roadside, old wounds in the earth's surface, too regular to be natural fault lines, too ancient to have been made by anything human. Pre-chakra scarring. Places where the world's original composition, the composition that predated Kaguya's alteration of the planet's energy system, still bled through. He crouched and pressed his palm to the nearest exposed scar in the roadside rock. The scar responded. Not with light or heat or sound. With recognition. The same fundamental recognition that the dark had given him through the fracture on the night of his birth, the recognition of like meeting like. This rock, wounded before chakra existed, felt the primordial in him and acknowledged it the way a wound acknowledges the hand that made it. Naruto stood. He had a kingdom to claim. He began to walk toward the interior, and the overcast sky above him seemed to deepen slightly, not darkening, not threatening, just becoming more thoroughly itself, more committed to its nature. Behind him, the road to the gate of Konoha grew smaller and smaller, and then disappeared entirely over the horizon. It was the last time he would ever look at it. 3 weeks later, in Konoha's Hokage office, Tsunade slammed a report down on her desk hard enough to rattle the sake cup she hadn't touched yet today, which was its own kind of event. The report was from a Konoha Anbu operative, designation Crow, who had been assigned to a routine intelligence sweep of the eastern borderlands. Standard coverage, nothing expected, just the ongoing practice of keeping eyes on the nothing places that occasionally became something places without warning. The report was 4 pages long. The first 3 pages were detailed, precise, professional, travel log, environmental observations. Noted changes in local atmospheric chakra density. The 4th page began mid-paragraph and ended mid-sentence, and the handwriting, which had been immaculate on the first 3 pages, deteriorated across the 4th into something that looked like the writer had been attempting to form letters while distracted by something vast. The final line read, "The land of silence has a king. I cannot describe his face. Every time I attempt to, I forget what I was trying to, that was all." Tsunade read it 3 times. The sake cup remained untouched. She sent for the council. 3 days after the council meeting, in the ruins of an old capital at the heart of the land of silence, Naruto Uzumaki sat cross-legged on the cracked stone floor where a throne had once been, and waited. He had been waiting for 3 days. He did not require food. He did not require water. He required nothing from the world around him currently, only that the world around him have sufficient time to become aware of his presence and decide what it was going to do about it. The land was deciding. He could feel it, the pre-chakra geology awakening beneath him, the ancient scarring resonating with his primordial blood in slow, massive pulses, like a heartbeat that measured time in centuries rather than seconds. The land of silence, which had been hosting warlords and their ambitions for generations, was conducting a much more fundamental kind of assessment. It was determining whether the thing that had arrived in its center belonged there. The answer came on the 3rd day, with no fanfare. The stone beneath him warmed, not with heat, with age. Naruto felt the geological memory of the land move through the stone and into his palm, centuries of accumulated pre-chakra presence recognizing and accepting what sat above it. The land of silence had its answer. And somewhere across the territory, in 3 separate compounds, 3 warlords who had ruled this land through fear and violence, and the perpetual threat of each other looked up from whatever they were doing and felt simultaneously. A cold certainty that something had changed. Something that could not be unchanged. Something permanent had arrived. Naruto opened his eyes in the ruins of the old capital, and in the deep, absolute blue of his gaze, behind the stillness that had no bottom, something that might have once been called a smile moved across his expression. Not warm, not cold, simply the expression of something that has waited a very long time and finds, finally, that the waiting is over. He pressed one hand to the cracked stone floor, and the stone, recognizing its sovereign, began to move. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Throne of What Was Before. Komori had ruled the eastern territories of the Land of Silence for 31 years through a simple philosophy. Know everything, reveal nothing, and ensure that the cost of moving against you always exceeded the benefit. He was not the strongest warlord in the land. He had never needed to be. Strength was a blunt instrument, useful, but expensive to maintain and easy to outmaneuver by someone with sufficient information. Information, by contrast, was cheap to collect and infinitely recyclable. You used the same secret twice if you were careful about sequencing. You let people believe you knew more than you did, which cost nothing and produced the same effect as actually knowing more than you did. He sat now in his tower's highest room, surrounded by the intelligence network he had spent 3 decades building, reports on silk paper in 17 different cipher systems. Messenger birds in cages that never made noise because he had modified their vocal cords when they were chicks. A map of the Land of Silence and its surrounding territories covered in a color-coding system that only he could read. And he was looking at the single report that none of his codes covered. 3 days ago, something had arrived in the ruins of the old capital. He knew this because 3 of his best operatives had gone to investigate and had returned giving contradictory accounts of what they had seen. This in itself was unusual. Komori selected his operatives for the specific quality of producing consistent, reliable testimony under debrief. He had never had 3 operatives return from the same location and produce 3 accounts so different that they appeared to describe separate events. The first operative said she had seen a young man sitting in the ruins. Blonde hair, blue eyes. He had not moved when she observed him. He had not appeared to notice her. She had left after an hour of observation with the feeling, not the intelligence-supported conclusion, the feeling that whatever she had been watching was not doing nothing. It was doing something for which she did not have a category. The second operative said he had seen no one. He had stood in the ruins for 4 hours and seen nothing but old stone. But his chakra network had spent 2 days after the mission behaving as if he had run it to exhaustion, which was not possible given what he had described doing. The third operative had seen a young man, as the first described, but had looked directly at his face and then been unable, in debrief, to reproduce any detail of it. Not because the face was forgettable. Because every time she assembled the details toward a picture, the picture dissolved. She could describe individual elements, the stillness, the quality of the blue eyes, the way the ruins seemed less ruined in his immediate vicinity, but could not produce a coherent image. She had wept during debrief, not from distress, she insisted, but from something she could not name that had nothing to do with distress. Komori had sent assassins. He was not proud of this, he preferred information to violence, but the variables were unacceptable, and the fastest way to eliminate an unacceptable variable was usually the direct approach. 12 assassins. His best. Each operating independently, using different routes and different techniques, because the second principle of his philosophy was that redundancy was the only insurance that actually paid out. Levin returned before dawn of the second day. They had approached the ruins, they reported, with complete technical precision. And then they had found themselves, without any clear moment of transition, on entirely different roads than the ones they had intended to travel. Not disoriented, they had known exactly where they were. They had simply been somewhere other than where they were going, with no memory of a decision to redirect. The 12th assassin had not returned. Komori had investigated. The 12th assassin had, by all available evidence, forgotten her assignment entirely. She was currently in a village 2 days' travel away, running a modest food stall, and when Komori's operative found her and asked about her mission, she had looked at him with genuine blankness. Not deception. Not the controlled blankness of someone concealing information. The absolute blankness of someone who has never heard of the thing she was being asked about. Komori looked at his map. At the color coding, only he could read. At 31 years of information about everything that moved through this land. He thought about the philosophy of knowing more than you revealed. He thought about what it meant to be someone whose entire power base rested on information. When the thing you were looking at produced information that his intelligence apparatus could not reliably collect. He thought about this for a long time. Then he did something he had never done in 31 years of territorial rule. He went himself. Jigoku did not think. This was not an insult. It was a considered, practical arrangement he had made with himself early in his career, when he had determined that the ratio of outcome improvement to cognitive investment produced by thinking was, in his specific case, poor. He was large. He was strong. He had chakra reserves that his former sensei, a man of considerable experience, had described as geologically inappropriate for a human being. He hit things until they stopped being problems, and this had worked reliably for 47 years, which was longer than most people who tried other approaches managed to survive. He had heard about the ruins. He had heard about Komori's assassins failing in the specific stupid way they had failed, walking in the wrong direction, forgetting their missions, and had produced, regarding this information, one thought. Komori uses subtle people for subtle problems. This is not a subtle problem. He mobilized his army. 1,400 soldiers, a mix of Jonin and Chunin-level fighters, the standing military force of the Land of Silence's western territories. He armed them for warfare, not reconnaissance. He marched them toward the ruins at a pace that communicated absolute confidence in the outcome. 3 kilometers from the ruins, his army stopped, not from an order, not from an obstacle, not from visible resistance of any kind. They simply could not proceed. Jigoku, at the column's head, pushed forward through his soldiers and reached the point at which forward motion had become impossible. He stood there for a moment, testing it. It was not a wall. It was not a genjutsu he could identify. It was not a killing intent so powerful it paralyzed the body. It was something different, a quality of the air that his body had never encountered before and for which it had no behavioral protocol. The air between him and the ruins was old. That was the only word his mind produced, not in the way that things were old, antiques, ruins, senior shinobi. In the way that time itself was old, as if the 3 kilometers between his position and the ruins contained not space but duration, accumulated years, centuries. Millennia pressed into the air like geological strata, and his body, which had walked through battlefield killing intent and Biju chakra, and every other form of hostile atmospheric condition the shinobi world produced, simply did not know how to walk through time. He stood there for an hour. His soldiers did not complain. They were soldiers of the Land of Silence, which meant they had been selected specifically for not complaining. But he could feel the quality of their silence changing from the focused silence of a force waiting to engage into something more uncertain. Jigoku, who did not think, thought what he thought was, I have hit every problem I have ever encountered and it has worked. This is the first problem I cannot locate to hit. What he thought next was, that is new information. He turned his army around. He marched them back to his compound. He sat in his throne room, a functional space, no ornamentation. Just a large chair elevated 3 feet above the floor because elevation communicated hierarchy and hierarchy communicated order, and he stared at the opposite wall. Eventually, something large and certain settled in Jigoku's chest. He was not afraid. Fear was a response to a threat you could calibrate. What he felt was more fundamental than fear. It was the response of something that has reached the edge of its operating parameters and is processing the fact that parameters exist. he sent a message to Komori. The message contained 4 words, which for Jigoku represented an unusually extended communication. What do we do? Komori's response arrived 6 hours later, which was 6 hours faster than Komori had ever responded to anything in their 31 years of mutually hostile coexistence. The response contained 7 words, which for Komori represented an unusually spare communication. We go together. Bring nothing that implies threat. Yamagiri had not sent assassins. She had not mobilized an army. She had not attempted intelligence gathering, because the specific thing her century of accumulated esoteric study had taught her was that there were categories of event for which the standard intelligence-gathering apparatus produced noise rather than signal. When the instrument was not calibrated for the phenomenon, running the instrument harder simply produced louder noise. She had gone on the first day. She was old in the way that certain things in the land of silence were old, past the point where age was a trajectory toward deterioration, and into the territory where age had become a fixed condition. She had maintained herself across a century through techniques that the great nations classified as heretical, and she classified as practical. Death-adjacent arts, soul-binding methodologies, the deep esoterica of traditions that predated the sage systematization of chakra into its current form. She was not immortal in any of the ways that the shinobi world had theoretical frameworks for. She was simply very, very good at negotiating with the parts of existence that preferred she stop existing, and those parts had, so far, been unable to produce a compelling enough argument. She sat across from Naruto in the ruins of the old capital with her hands in her lap, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. This was fine with both of them. Yamagiri had long since left behind the human compulsion to fill silence. Naruto, for his part, had simply become the silence, not metaphorically, not poetically. The silence of the land of silence organized itself around him the way water organized around a stone. He was not the absence of sound. He was the thing that sound declined to enter. You are not a shinobi, Yamagiri said finally. She said it not as an accusation but as a classification, the way a naturalist names a species. Not anymore. The first words Naruto had spoken in 3 days. His voice was the same tenor, the same fundamental quality, but it carried now the way a voice carries in a very large, very empty space. Not amplified, simply present in a way that made the space's size irrelevant. What are you? He looked at her. Not studying her, he already knew what she was. He was deciding how to frame something that didn't have standard frames. The question assumes I became something, he said. I didn't become, I remembered. Yamagiri sat with this. A century of studying the junction between life and death had given her a finely calibrated instrument for detecting when she was in the presence of something that operated by different rules than the ones she had spent her life mapping. That instrument was currently producing readings it had never produced before, not in the presence of a biju, not in the presence of a reanimated cage, not in the presence of any of the things she had stood before in 100 years of standing before extraordinary things. She leaned forward slightly and looked at him with the specific attention of someone who has been searching for a thing for a very long time and is uncertain whether she has finally found it or is experiencing the elaborate deception of hope. The old texts, she said carefully. The ones that predate the sage. The ones that the current system's scholars classify as mythological because they describe a time before chakra existed. They reference something. She paused, selecting words with the care of someone who understood that imprecision was expensive. A presence, a condition of the world before its current condition. Something that the god tree's existence, and by extension, Kaguya's, and by extension the sage's, and by extension everything we call the shinobi world, buried rather than replaced. Naruto waited. They call it different things in different texts, Yamagiri continued. The first silence, the antecedent dark, the condition before condition. She met his eyes. I have spent 60 years looking for evidence that it still existed. that it survived what Kaguya's arrival did to the world's composition. A pause. I had begun to conclude that it hadn't. It was patient, Naruto said. How long? Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, the recognition of an irony too large to be straightforwardly funny. It was here before long existed. Yamagiri looked at him for another long moment. Then she placed both palms on the ruined stone floor and lowered her forehead to meet them. The bow was not performed. It was not the calculated political gesture of a warlord calculating survival odds. It was the genuine obeisance of someone who has spent a century in the study of a subject and has finally, after all that time, met the subject itself. "What do you require?" she asked, her forehead still against the stone. Naruto looked at the woman bowing before him. A century old, impossibly durable, the most genuinely learned person in the land of silence, and probably the most genuinely learned person he would encounter in a long time. He thought about what he required. "Stand up," he said. "I need an advisor more than I need someone bowing." Yamagiri straightened. And for the first time in Naruto's observation of her, something that might have been relief moved across her ancient features, the specific relief of someone who has just discovered that the thing they have devoted their life to turns out to be worth it. Komori and Jigoku arrived together on the fourth day, as Komori's message had said they would. They came without weapons they intended to use. Komori in his formal intelligence chief attire, dark, understated, every fold of fabric a studied communication, and Jigoku in what passed for his ceremonial gear, which was essentially his standard gear, but with the blood cleaned off. They found Naruto in the main hall of the ruins, standing at the window, if a gap in a crumbling wall could be called a window, looking out at the overcast sky. Yamagiri sat in the corner, her presence adding a specific quality to the room's atmosphere that Komori catalogued immediately, and which made him recalibrate every assumption he had brought through the door. If Yamagiri, who did not bow to things, was in this room voluntarily, then Komori's intelligence about this situation was not incomplete. It was in the wrong category entirely. He went through his response protocols in order. Threat assessment, escape route identification, bargaining position evaluation, alliance possibility analysis. He reached the end of the protocols and discovered that they all pointed in the same direction, which had never happened before. "You're the intelligence apparatus," Naruto said, without turning from the window. Not a question. Komori noticed that Naruto hadn't moved since they entered the room and that his awareness of their arrival had been immediate regardless. "Among other things," Komori said, professionally, carefully. "And you hit things," Naruto said to Jigoku. Jigoku, to his credit, did not take offense at this characterization. "Yes," he said, "then you both have useful functions." Naruto turned from the window. Komori had been the third of his assassin's targets, the one who had returned blank-faced and built a food stall. He had reviewed the debrief documentation extensively. He had prepared himself, as thoroughly as 31 years of professional preparation allowed, for what he might see when he looked at whatever had arrived in the ruins of the old capital. He looked at Naruto's face. He looked directly at it, with the trained attention of someone whose entire career had been built on extracting information from observation. He catalogued what he saw. Blonde hair, the kind of blonde that looked almost white in overcast light. A face that was, he struggled for a moment, young. Younger than the presence in the room implied. Blue eyes that contained something he filed, inadequately, as depth without bottom. He would write his intelligence report on this meeting later. He would delete the face section 3 times before accepting that the best he could produce was young, blonde, blue-eyed. Cannot be fully described without the description becoming inadequate in a way that makes the inadequacy itself the data. "I'm going to offer you a choice," Naruto said. "Not between compliance and resistance. That choice was made before you walked in here, and you both know which side you landed on. A different choice." He looked at Komori specifically. "You've built something genuinely useful. I have no interest in dismantling it. I have interest in what it becomes if it's running on something better than chakra and political leverage." Komori processed this. "You're offering to transform us. I'm offering to give you a permanent stake in something permanent. Whether that's an offer or a statement of what's going to happen either way is a distinction you can choose how to feel about." A pause. Komori nodded, one precise professional dip of the head. "What do we lose?" "The parts of yourselves that were temporary," Naruto said. The transformation was not what either of them had imagined, which was partly because neither of them had had an accurate imaginative framework for what primordial blood did to a human system. Komori had expected something ceremonial. Jigoku had expected something painful. It was neither. It was simply complete. Naruto drew blood from his own palm. Not with a weapon, it simply appeared, the way a very deep cut appears when something ancient decides the surface of the skin is no longer an obstacle. And the blood that welled from the wound was not the standard biological red, but something darker at its edges. Something that seemed to absorb the low light of the ruined hall rather than reflect it. When it touched them, their chakra systems did not fight it. There was no dramatic conflict, no rejection, no painful restructuring. The primordial blood simply replaced the chakra network's infrastructure at a level below the biological, below the cellular, below the elemental. It replaced the scaffolding that the chakra network had been built on, which meant the network itself remained, but was now running on something fundamentally older and more durable than the energy it had been designed around. Komori felt his genjutsu, 30 years of developed technique, the finest sound manipulation arts in the land of silence, shift in register. Still present, still operational. But changed in the same way that a river changes when you alter its source. Same river, different water. His techniques now reached into targets' blood rather than their chakra networks, into the biological record of memory rather than the neural processing of perception. He could not just create illusions anymore. He could edit what had actually happened in the record that a person's blood carried. Jigoku felt himself become quiet. He had never been quiet. He had been 47 years of force and volume and the particular mass of a body that had been weaponized since childhood. The quietness was not weakness. He immediately understood it was the opposite. It was the quietness of a thing that no longer needed to announce itself because its presence was not optional. He flexed his hand and felt the stone floor crack beneath his feet from the adjustment of weight alone. He had not tried to crack it. He decided this was acceptable. The fortress grew over the following 3 weeks. Not built, grown. Naruto walked the pre-chakra geological scars of the land of silence and drew blood script along their exposed surfaces. And the ancient geology responded to the primordial language the same way it had responded to his palm's touch on the first day. With recognition, with acceptance, with the specific willingness of a thing that has been waiting for instruction since before the entity that would give it instruction had been born. Stone rose from below the surface in configurations that no architect would have designed, because no architect had the physics for them. The fortress that emerged from the land operated by spatial rules that the standard shinobi world did not have. Its interior was larger than its exterior in ways that were not gradual or subtle. The throne room was cathedral vast inside a structure that the outside observer would have categorized as moderate. The corridors reorganized according to blood script written on their walls, which meant they led to different destinations depending on who was walking them. The fortress had no fixed map. It had the map that the sovereign chose for it on any given day. Yamagiri supervised the esoteric aspects of the construction with the specific focus of someone who had spent 60 years preparing for exactly this task, without knowing what the task would be. She contributed her century of accumulated death-adjacent knowledge. The boundary between the fortress and the external world was not just a physical wall, but a jurisdictional one. The death god's mechanisms, which she had spent decades mapping, were redirected at the fortress's perimeter. Anything that died within the fortress boundaries had its soul energy absorbed by the structure rather than delivered to whatever came next. The fortress was, in a specific and technical sense, becoming increasingly difficult for the concept of death to locate. Komori's intelligence network was rewired over the same 3 weeks. His blood-bound informants, operating across the land of silence and beginning to extend tendrils into surrounding territory, were restructured around the new blood sorcery rather than chakra transmission. The network became invisible to Sensor Ninja, not because it was hidden, but because it operated below the level that chakra sensing could detect. His informants existed in Sensor Ninja sweeps as ordinary civilians with unremarkable chakra signatures. They were ordinary civilians, except that their blood carried an edited layer of loyalty and information transmission capability that no standard shinobi examination could identify. By the end of 3 weeks, the Land of Silence had a king, a court, a fortress, and a political reality that the 5 great nations had not yet fully processed. The processing began with the Anbu report that arrived on Tsunede's desk, confused, contradictory, ending mid-sentence. And then the second report, from a different operative with the same quality of professional degradation in the final pages. And then a third, from a Sand Jonin who had skirted the territory's border on a separate assignment and reported that his chakra sensing, reliable to 30 kilometers in optimal conditions, produced complete static in the direction of the Land of Silence. Not interference. Not distance-related degradation. Silence. As if the territory in that direction had decided to opt out of having a chakra-present signature, the council meetings that followed in each of the 5 villages were held in varying registers of concern. Konoha's was sharp and contained. Suna's was methodical. Kumo's was the loudest because the Raikage's preferred register for expressing concern was volume. None of them, in these initial meetings, said the name Naruto Uzumaki. The intelligence was not yet specific enough to produce the connection. They discussed a new power in the Land of Silence. A possible new daimyo, an esoteric practitioner of unusual ability. A territorial consolidation by an unknown party. They sent a joint envoy. 12 elite jonin. 2 sensory specialists, a sealing master and Killer Bee, who had heard things that made him curious in the way that only things that could kill him reliably made him curious. The envoy crossed the border of the Land of Silence in standard formation. 6 in front, 6 behind, sensory specialists flanking, and proceeded for 2 hours along the road toward the ruins that the intelligence suggested were the focal point of whatever had consolidated here. After 2 hours, the lead sensory specialist stopped the column. "We're not moving," she said. The formation leader, a Konoha jonin named Hiro who had 20 years of field experience, looked at the road ahead of them. "We've been walking. We have been walking," the sensory specialist agreed. "We have covered no ground." She pointed at a distinctive rock formation she had been using as a landmark since they crossed the border. It was the same distance ahead of them now as it had been when she first identified it, 2 hours ago. Blood cartography, the map redrawn beneath their feet, the spatial relationship between the border and the destination silently modified to keep the destination at a fixed distance from any unauthorized approach. They could walk until their legs gave out. The road would simply keep agreeing with itself. Killer Bee, at the rear of the formation, said nothing. He was doing mental calculations. Then Naruto was in front of them, not arriving, not approaching from a distance. In front of them, as if he had always been in front of them and they had simply not noticed. The sensory specialist's instruments, their extended chakra perception, registered his arrival as nothing. No chakra displacement, no appearing presence, simply previously absent, currently present. He looked at the envoy for a moment. 12 elite jonin, the best the 5 great nations thought worth sending, and Killer Bee in his distinctive combination of formal wrapper and improbable creative energy. Naruto's gaze moved across each of them with the quality of an accounting being done. Not a power assessment, something more fundamental, a categorization. "You want to come inside," he said. Statement, not question. The formation leader began the formal address he had prepared. Naruto looked at him. Just looked. The formal address lost its momentum after 11 words and stopped. Not because anything prevented it, because it suddenly felt, to the man delivering it, like explaining a cooking technique to geography. Yes, Hiro finally said. The honest answer underneath the prepared one. Naruto considered them for a moment longer. The rock formation that had been a fixed distance ahead of them for 2 hours was now abruptly behind them. The road before them led directly, unambiguously, to the fortress. "Then come," Naruto said, and walked ahead and did not look back. Killer Bee, falling into step at the column's rear, wrote 3 bars of verse in his head about what he was currently feeling. He discarded all 3. Some things he was discovering were genuinely outside his vocabulary. He fell into step and followed the king of a darkness older than the world toward a fortress that should not architecturally exist, and thought about the blonde kid who used to eat ramen by himself at Ikaraku's and dream about a hat. "Yo," he said quietly, to no one, to everyone. "This got complicated." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Hemomancy and the Architecture of Dominion. The throne room should not have existed. This was the first thing Hiro registered when the envoy was led through the fortress's final corridor, and the passage opened into the space beyond. Not the throne, not the court, not the sovereign himself, but the simple architectural impossibility of the room they were standing in. He had walked through the fortress's exterior approaching it. He had a field-trained spatial awareness that 20 years of high-level missions had refined into something close to instinct. He knew how large the structure was on the outside. The room was 3 times that size on the inside. Not approximately, not in the way that clever architecture could create the illusion of space. That was a trick he knew, had used himself in field fortification. This was not a trick. The ceiling was 40 feet above them. The walls were further apart than the building's outer shell permitted them to be. The mathematics of the space simply did not agree with the mathematics of the structure containing it, and the room had no apparent interest in resolving this contradiction. Hiro had filed this observation in the 30 seconds it took the envoy to cross the threshold, because 20 years of field experience had taught him that environmental impossibilities were data, and data needed to be collected before it was processed. And processing it before collection was how capable shinobi got killed by things they should have survived. He collected the rest of the room in the same window. The court stood behind the throne, 3 figures, distinct enough to observe, wrong enough in their details to resist complete classification. The one on the left, lean, dark-clothed, a stillness that was professional rather than natural. The one in the center, enormous, physically, the kind of enormous that exceeded even the largest shinobi Hiro had encountered in his career, and yet standing with a quietness that bodies that size simply did not carry. The one on the right, ancient, a woman whose age defied estimation, sitting rather than standing, which was either a statement or an accommodation that the sovereign made for her specifically. The throne was not ornate. This surprised Hiro more than the room's dimensions. He had prepared, in the briefing sessions before deployment, for spectacle, the kind of theatrical power display that new sovereigns typically invested in, the physical vocabulary of "take me seriously." The throne was stone, risen from the floor as a continuous piece, the same dark geology as the fortress walls. No carvings, no precious materials, just the geometry of elevation, the absolute minimum visual communication required to indicate that this was where the sovereign sat, and the sovereign's presence was sufficient to handle everything else. Naruto was already seated when they entered. Hiro had not seen him move ahead to take the throne. He had followed Naruto down the corridor, and then the corridor had ended and Naruto was behind them in the throne. Not transitionally, not in the way of extreme speed, which left afterimages and displaced air. Simply there, in the way that things which belonged in a space were simply in it. The sensory specialists flanking the formation were in visible distress. Hiro could see it in their peripheral postures, the specific tension of shinobi who are running an instrument and receiving readings that the instrument was not designed to process. They were searching for Naruto's chakra signature with the extended perception they had spent careers developing. They were finding a void where a presence should have registered, not a suppressed signature, not a concealed one, a void, the complete and total absence of chakra where a living body was self-evidently present and operating. For a sensor ninja, this was approximately equivalent to looking directly at something and having the eyes report that nothing was there. The cognitive dissonance produced a specific physiological stress response that manifested in both specialists as a fine tremor in the hands and a difficulty tracking the room's geometry. Hiro noted this and made himself not dwell on its implications. He stepped forward to deliver the diplomatic address. The address was prepared. Hiro had delivered diplomatic communications in 12 different political contexts across his career. To feudal lords, to foreign Kage, to criminal organizations being offered formal amnesty, to entities that occupied the complicated middle ground between human and something the classification systems didn't have clean language for. He was good at it. He was good at it because he understood that diplomatic language was not about what was said, but about what the saying signaled. The willingness to engage the ritual of communication as a mutual acknowledgment that both parties had something to lose from escalation. He began. The address established the 5 great nations' recognition of the Land of Silence as a sovereign state. It expressed the desire for formal diplomatic relations. It noted the mutual benefits of open communication and economic cooperation. It was, in its way, a masterwork of saying the minimum necessary while implying the maximum necessary. The acknowledgement that something had changed here, that the 5 great nations were prepared to accept that change rather than contest it, offered in language that allowed everyone present to treat this as a choice rather than a compulsion. Naruto let him finish. This, Hiro later reflected, was itself significant. Whatever he had expected from the sovereign of the Land of Silence, interruption, impatience, the performance of not needing to listen, Naruto simply waited for the address to complete with the patience of something that measured time differently than the people in front of him. Then he said, "Your nations may continue to exist." 6 words. Hiro processed them. He was a professional. He processed them with the same systematic attention he had given the room's impossible geometry. Your nations may continue to exist. Not, I accept your diplomatic relations. Not, thank you for your recognition of our sovereignty. Not any of the standard response registers that diplomatic language anticipated and had prepared counters for. Simply the quiet statement that the alternative, that their nations might not continue to exist, had been a live consideration, and that this consideration had been resolved in their favor. Hiro had delivered diplomatic communications in 12 different political contexts. He had never, in any of those contexts, been on the receiving end of a sentence that restructured the entire conversation's power dynamic in 6 words without apparent effort. He kept his face professional. Beside him, he felt the sealing master's scroll cases go very slightly rigid, not from reaching for a scroll, from gripping them. The formal portion of the meeting continued for approximately 40 minutes. Naruto spoke rarely, and with the economy of someone for whom words were a concession to the other party's need for them rather than a primary communication mode. When he did speak, the court around him remained absolutely still, not deferential stillness, the stillness of things that did not need to react because they were extensions of a single will that was already fully expressed. Questions were posed about the Land of Silence's territorial intentions, about the fate of the 14 minor nations that had begun realigning toward its sphere of influence, about the chakra instability reports that the Biju had been producing. Naruto's answers were consistent in their structure, minimum words, maximum implication. The territorial intentions were the territory's own business. The minor nations had made choices that the five great nations had given them reason to make. The Biju instability was a natural response to proximity to something older than the tailed beasts, and would continue as a matter of physics rather than policy. The sealing master, a woman from Konoha named Ren, had spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting attempting to run passive analytical techniques on the fortress's architecture, the throne's composition, and the court members' presence. Her sealing scripts, written invisibly on her forearms in a technique she had used for 15 years without a failure, had gone blank within 5 minutes of entering the room. Not dispelled, blank, as if the scripts had forgotten they existed. In the 25th minute, she stopped attempting passive analysis and simply observed. This was, professionally speaking, the correct pivot. When the instrument fails, observe with what you have left. What she had left was 20 years of experience with sealing arts, with the technical language of chakra manipulation at its most fundamental level, and what that experience told her, observing the throne room and its occupant, was that the architecture of this space was not built. It was written. There was a script operating at the level of the room's physics, not on the walls, not inscribed on surfaces, but in the spatial relationships themselves. The 40-foot ceiling was not constructed. It was stated the way a mathematical proof states a conclusion. The corridor that had brought them here, the spatial loop that had kept them at a fixed distance from the fortress for 2 hours, all of it was language. A language she could recognize as language without being able to read a word of it. She filed this carefully and kept her face professional. The incident happened in the 38th minute. One of the Jonin in the rear of the formation, a specialist from Kumo named Taka, whose particular skill set included the most powerful lightning-natured technique in the Hidden Clouds mission-ready roster, made a decision. He made it quietly, without signaling his intent to the formation leader, without coordination with the other envoy members. He made it because 38 minutes of standing in an impossible room in front of an entity whose chakra the sensors couldn't find was producing in him a specific kind of professional anxiety that expressed itself as the need to remind everyone in the room, including himself, that the five great nations were not here without options. His technique was an S-rank lightning release, a bolt of compressed, directional electrical force that moved at speeds that made visual tracking theoretical rather than practical. He had used it in 4 separate combat engagements. He had not missed in 4 separate combat engagements. He did not signal. He formed the hand signs in 2 seconds, considerably faster than the standard execution time because he was good at this, and released. The technique traveled toward Naruto. Hiro saw it happen, and in the same instant, understood that it was the worst decision made in the diplomatic history of the 5 great nations, and that he was about to watch his career become the second casualty after whatever happened to Taka. The technique traveled toward Naruto, and slowed. Not from a counter-technique. Not from a barrier or a defensive jutsu or any active intervention from the court. It simply slowed, the way a thing slows when the medium it's traveling through becomes increasingly resistant. The electrical coherence of the bolt began to degrade at its edges, the tight, focused compression of an S-rank technique losing its structure, reverting, becoming less specific. Less itself. The lightning became bright light, then warm light, then the residual warmth of air that had briefly been energized, and then nothing. It dissipated 3 feet in front of Naruto's chest. He had not moved. The court behind him had not moved. Naruto looked at the space where the technique had been, and then at Taka, who was now the subject of 11 other envoy members' attention, all of it the specific variety of attention that said you have just made this significantly harder for all of us. Ninjutsu, Naruto said into a room that had become absolutely silent, is a technology. His voice was not raised. It filled the room the way the room's own air filled it, naturally, completely, without effort. An impressive one, built on Kaguya's alteration of the world's energy system, built on the sage's codification of that alteration into something teachable. thousands of years of refinement into hand signs and chakra manipulation and elemental release. A pause. I predate the technology, the way I predate your nations, the way I predate chakra itself. He looked at Taka with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite pity, but occupied the space between them. That technique is a masterwork of what you are capable of. I want you to understand that I'm not dismissing it. I am simply older than it. Taka said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was in front of him. Hiro stepped forward. That action was unauthorized and does not represent the envoy's intent. We apologize. No, Naruto said, and Hiro stopped. Don't apologize for it. It was an honest response to an uncomfortable situation. I prefer honest responses. A slight pause. Dishonest ones take longer to correct. Killer Bee had positioned himself, with apparent casualness, in the left corner of the formation. Apparent, because Killer Bee's casualness was always calculated. He was a Jinchuriki who had survived to adulthood, which required a specific kind of intelligence that expressed itself as social ease and was actually constant environmental processing. He had been watching since they entered. Watching Naruto specifically, the way one Jinchuriki watches another, with the attention of someone who knew what it felt like to carry something enormous inside yourself and was looking for the signs of it. He found no signs. Not suppressed signs, no signs. Whatever Naruto carried, it expressed differently than anything B had a reference framework for. The eight tails inside him, Juki, had been uncharacteristically quiet since they crossed the border. Not afraid, uncertain. Juki, who had existed for longer than the land of silence's geological record and had opinions about everything, was uncertain. This was notable enough that B had mentioned it before deployment, and the Raikage had not known what to do with it and had sent him anyway. B stepped forward from the formation's edge during a pause in the formal address. Yo, he said, because B's diplomatic language was his own. Can I ask you something straight? Hiro had a moment of intense professional suffering that he managed to contain to his left eye. Naruto looked at B. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. The recognition, B would later think, of someone who had spent his whole life surrounded by people performing being normal and was currently looking at someone who had never bothered. Yes, Naruto said. Juki, my partner, the Eight Tails, she's been quiet since we crossed your border, and she's never quiet. B paused. She says you feel like something she remembers from before she was herself, before the tailed beasts were what they are. She doesn't have words for it. Neither do I, Naruto said. Not words that exist in any current language. But she's right. B nodded slowly. He was running something through his head, not verse this time, genuine reckoning. You were a Jinchuriki, he said. Kurama's 9 tails. I was. Is Kurama still in there? A pause that carried weight. Yes. He okay? Another pause. Longer. Something moved through Naruto's expression that was too complex to classify in real-time observation. Hiro caught it and filed it for later analysis without being able to name it. He's adjusted, Naruto finally said. B looked at him for a moment longer. Then he did something that no one in the room expected. He extended his fist. A fist bump. The specific interpersonal gesture of a man who expressed solidarity in the same register, regardless of context. The room was very still. Naruto looked at the extended fist. And then, not slowly, not dramatically, he reached out and met it. The contact lasted 1 second. In that second, a single bead of blood, B's, from a training callus that had split at the knuckle earlier that morning, transferred to Naruto's skin. In that second, Naruto received everything that blood carried, Juki's complete chakra signature. Eight Tails accumulated techniques and combat history across 1,000 years of existence. B's own chakra nature, his techniques, his creative work, his memories. Every mission. Every person he had loved. Every verse he had ever written that he'd been too embarrassed to perform. All of it, transferred in the biological language that predated everything else. Naruto absorbed it with the stillness of a very deep body of water receiving a stone, a ripple at the surface, then nothing. Everything settled. B felt it happen. He felt the transfer the way a Jinchuriki felt chakra moving, a pulling sensation, not painful, just complete. He blinked. "You took something," he said, not accusingly. "Your blood offered it," Naruto said. "I don't take what isn't offered. Be thought about this." "Juki okay. Juki is inside you, unchanged. The signature I have is a copy, not a removal." A pause. "She's been given a window into something she was asking to see. She can look for as long as she wants." From somewhere very deep inside Killer Bee's seal, Juki, the eight-tailed ox-octopus, ancient and enormous and uncertain for the first time in centuries, pressed up against the barrier of the transfer and looked at what lay on the other side. She looked for a long time. What she saw, she would never find language for, even in the old tongue that predated human speech. But she would tell Bee, later, in the privacy of their seal space, that it was like standing on the shore of an ocean and realizing that you had spent your entire existence thinking the shore was the world, and the ocean had always been there and was exactly as large as it looked. The meeting concluded in the 45th minute. Naruto stood from the throne, the first time he had moved from it in the entire meeting, and the act of standing rearranged the room's atmosphere the way a pressure system rearranges weather. "The great nations will receive formal documentation of the Land of Silence's territorial arrangements within 1 month," he said. "The documentation will not require your signatures. It will simply tell you what exists. What you do with the information is your own matter." He turned to leave. Hyro, operating on 20 years of professional instinct, asked the question that the mission briefing had designated secondary, but that had been primary in his mind since the corridor. "The villages that have aligned with you. What are you asking of them?" Naruto paused. He turned his head fractionally, not quite looking back. "Nothing your system didn't already take," he said. "I ask for no tribute, no soldiers, no political performance of loyalty. I ask that they do not act against my interests, and in exchange, nothing will touch them that I don't allow to touch them." Hyro stopped himself, reorganized. "That's not a sustainable political model. Nations require resources." "Nations require resources," Naruto agreed. "I am not a nation." He resumed walking. "I am a condition. Conditions don't have operating costs." The court fell in behind him, Komori and Jigoku moving with the specific purpose of things that had always moved like this, Yamagiri rising from her seat with the unhurried dignity of a century. And then they were gone, and the envoy was alone in the throne room. The room, without its occupants, felt different. Not empty, the impossible geometry remained, the space that couldn't exist continuing to exist. But the quality of the presence that had been organizing the room's atmosphere was absent, and the room now felt the way a space feels after something significant has passed through it. Ren, the ceiling master, walked to the exact center of the room and crouched down. She pressed her palm to the floor and ran her most precise analytical technique, something she had developed herself over 15 years, capable of reading residual chakra impressions down to a week's age. She rid the floor for 3 minutes. She stood up. "There's no chakra residue," she said. To no one, to everyone, to the room. "In an enclosed space where multiple people have been present for 45 minutes, there is no chakra residue." She looked at her hand. "Do you understand what that means? Chakra leaves traces on environments. Every technique ever used, every person who's been somewhere for more than a few minutes, it leaves residue. It's basic forensic fuinjutsu." She looked at the space where the throne was. "There's nothing here. It's as if we were the only people in this room." The implications of this settled over the formation like weather. Taka, from the back, said, "What does that mean for us? If he has no chakra signature, if he leaves no trace?" "It means," Hyro said carefully, "that every detection system, every early warning network, every sensor post that the 5 great nations operate, he's invisible to all of it. He could be anywhere. He could have been anywhere. We would not know." The silence that followed was the particular silence of professionals processing a threat assessment that has just expanded past the edges of their frameworks. Killer Bee broke it. He's not going to be anywhere, B said. He's going to be exactly where he is. He looked at the throne. He doesn't need to move. That's kind of the whole thing. He paused. He won, bro. Like before we got here, the winning already happened. We're just the part where everybody figures it out. Nobody disagreed. The envoys returned to their respective villages, produced reports of varying quality, and a uniformly poor ability to convey what had actually occurred in the Land of Silence's throne room. Hyro's report to Konoha was precise, professional, and contained 3 separate notes in its margins, added after the initial draft in different ink that read, "This section is accurate but insufficient." He could not identify what the insufficiency was. He knew it was there. The sensory specialist's technical reports were essentially useless. They had recorded static for 45 minutes. The absence of data was data, but it was data that required a framework that didn't yet exist. Ren's ceiling analysis was the most substantively disturbing report produced, because it was the one that most specifically quantified what the great nations were dealing with. An entity that left no forensic trace, operated below chakra's detection threshold, and had apparently replaced conventional chakra physics within his territory with a system that standard Fuinjutsu could identify as a system and could not read a word of. The Hokage read the reports. He read them 3 times. He called for B's report specifically. B's report was delivered in verse, as all his reports were, followed by reluctant prose translation at his brother's insistence. The prose translation contained, buried in its 8th paragraph, a line that the Hokage underlined 3 times and then sat looking at for a very long time. He's not trying to be Hokage anymore, bro. He's trying to be everything the Hokage ever bowed to. The Hokage stared at this line. Then he called a meeting of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And in the deep corridors of the fortress in the Land of Silence, in the hour between midnight and the first gray suggestion of dawn, Naruto stood at the highest point of the structure and looked out at the overcast sky. His sky over his land. Under the jurisdiction of a sovereignty that predated every political arrangement that had ever tried to govern it, and felt the settlement of a thing in its correct place. Kurama was quiet in the seal, not gone. Present, the way a very old, very tired thing is present when it has run out of arguments and is waiting to see what happens next. You could have gone in, Naruto said, in the seal space where their communication lived. When I left the gate. You could have flooded me with chakra, made it harder. Yes, Kurama said. Why didn't you a long pause, the specific pause of something choosing honesty over strategy? Because I looked at what was in the second room, Kurama said. And I decided that fighting it would be like trying to hold back the dark with my hands. Another pause. And because, and I want it known that I am saying this once and will not repeat it, because you were never just a vessel to me. You were always the most annoying, loudest, most infuriatingly persistent person I had ever been sealed inside. And that person deserved to be more than what this world was willing to make him. Naruto was quiet for a moment. That's the closest you've come to saying you care about me. I will not repeat it, Kurama said firmly. I know. The sky above the Land of Silence was absolutely overcast, absolutely dark. The stars invisible behind cloud cover that had existed here longer than the people who named stars. Naruto stood in it and felt for a moment the specific ache of someone who had wanted something for his entire life and had then outgrown the wanting, which was not the same as the wanting being satisfied. He thought about ramen. He thought about Chuchai's counter, the steam, the specific red of Ikaraku's fabric curtain against evening light. He thought about sitting alone at that counter at 7 years old with a bowl of miso ramen that was too hot, eating it slowly to make it last, the one uncomplicated good thing in a day that had otherwise been a collection of small cruelties. He held the memory carefully, not with grief, with something that did not have a name in the current world's vocabulary, the tender regard of a thing that has become permanent for the last moment it was still temporary. Then he put it away. He turned from the sky and descended into his fortress. He had a kingdom to administer. He had a world to begin, slowly and inevitably to reshape. He had time, he had all of it. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The will of fire was always smoke. Kakashi Hatake had survived things that should not have been survivable. He had survived the death of his father at an age when children were still learning the geography of loss. He had survived Obaido, not just the first death, the cave-in and the crushed body and the hand extended through rubble, but the second one, the revelation that the boy he had grieved for decades had become something that the world needed to be protected from. He had survived Rin. He carried Rin the way a man carries a wound that closed around the instrument that made it, healed over, sealed, the thing itself still inside. He had survived being Hokage, which was its own category of attrition. He was good at surviving things. He had built an entire identity on the specific competence of continuing to exist in a world that kept giving him reasons not to. The Sharingan in his left socket was the most visible symbol of this. A dead friend's eye, kept alive in someone else's face, used to see the world with more precision than the original owner had survived to use it for. Kakashi had always found the symbolism appropriate rather than macabre. It suited him. Carrying the dead was what he did. He stood at the gate of the Land of Silence's territory beside Sakura Haruno and understood, with the clarity of a man who had trained himself to understand things before they became emergencies, that this mission was different from every other thing he had survived. Not because it was more dangerous. Danger was calibrated. Danger had mechanics that experience could read and prepare for. Because for the first time in his career, Kakashi was walking toward something that used to be someone he loved, and he did not know which of those two categories, something or someone, was more accurate anymore. They were permitted across the border without obstruction. Sakura had expected resistance. The professional part of her had spent the journey preparing response scenarios, running through her medical ninjutsu capabilities, assessing what she knew about the court members, doing the calculus of what two people could accomplish against whatever the Land of Silence had become. She was good at calculus. She had become, in the years since the war, genuinely exceptional, a medical nin whose precision exceeded Tsunade's in certain technical categories, a combatant whose strength was Konoha-level legend. She had run the calculus for most of the 3-day journey. The border crossing made all of it irrelevant in the same way that a very long preparation for a conversation becomes irrelevant when the conversation begins and turns out to be about something else entirely. They crossed the border and walked into the prechakra static, the atmospheric quality that the envoy's sensory specialists had described as static, which was the closest standard shinobi vocabulary could get to the actual phenomenon. It was not quite static. It was more like the feeling of standing in a very old building, where the accumulated time of the structure pressed on the present moment with physical weight. Every step carried the sensation of walking through duration as well as space. Sakura's chakra network registered the environment's effect immediately, a subtle, persistent destabilization, not enough to impair function, enough to make function feel effortful in a way it normally wasn't. She compensated automatically, adjusted her baseline output, kept walking. Kakashi, beside her, showed nothing externally. She knew him well enough to read the tells anyway, the slight adjustment in his stride, the way his hand moved half an inch toward the tanto at his back, and then deliberately returned to neutral. They walked for an hour. The fortress grew ahead of them at a rate that suggested they were approaching it normally, which was itself unusual. The envoy's report had described the blood cartography effect, the spatial loop that kept unauthorized approach at a fixed distance. They were being allowed to approach. The path was open because something had decided the path should be open. This was not reassuring. Naruto was in a room that was not the throne room. They were shown there by Komori, shown, not escorted, because the distinction mattered and Komori understood that every element of presentation was communication. Being shown somewhere implied an option. Being escorted implied the absence of one. Naruto had specified shown. The room was smaller than the throne room. Furnished in the minimal way the fortress was furnished, stone, space, a quality of light that was not quite any light source Sakura could identify, not torchlight, not sunlight, not chakra light. Just illumination, sourceless and even as if the room itself had decided to be visible. Naruto stood at the room's single window. Not a prepared position, or if it was prepared so completely that the preparation had become invisible. He was wearing what Sakura's mind initially categorized as dark clothing, before it recognized that categorization was insufficient. The fabric, if fabric was the right word for something that seemed to hold darkness the way water holds its own properties, moved like regular clothing and remained somehow wrong in a way she kept trying to recategorize and kept failing. The orange was gone. She had expected to feel something specific about the orange being gone. What she actually felt, looking at him, was that the orange had never been wrong so much as incomplete. The person in front of her now was wearing the correct thing, and that correctness was more disturbing than any dramatic transformation would have been. He turned when they entered. The face was Naruto's face. She had braced for change, for the physical alterations that extreme power usually wrote on a body. There were none. The whisker marks, the specific angular quality of his features, the blonde that was almost white in the room's sourceless light, all of it exactly as she remembered. The only difference, the stillness. Naruto had never been still. He had been the most physically expressive person she had known, hands moving when he talked, body leaning forward into everything, energy that needed to be constantly redistributed because it accumulated faster than he could process it. The person in this room was absolutely still. It was the most profound physical change she had ever observed in a human being, and it was the complete absence of a quality rather than the addition of anything new. "Sakura," he said. "Kakashi-sensei." The names were said with care. Not warmly, warmth implied a temperature, and the room had no temperature in the conventional sense. With care, the specific care of someone choosing to acknowledge something that mattered rather than something that was required. Kakashi's visible eye was steady. "You look the same," he said. "I am the same," Naruto said, "and I'm not. Both things are accurate. That's not usually how identity works." "It's not usually how anything works," Naruto agreed, "until it does." They sat, Sakura and Kakashi on the stone bench along one wall, Naruto in a chair across from them that had risen from the floor with the same geological continuity as everything else in the fortress. The sourceless light held steady. Outside the window, the land of silence's perpetual overcast pressed against the glass, if it was glass, with the comfortable familiarity of a condition that had decided it was permanent. The first 20 minutes were not easy. Kakashi had prepared what he was going to say. He was a man who prepared things, who ran missions in his head before he ran them in the field, who rehearsed conversations he needed to have because he had discovered early that unrehearsed important conversations tended to fail in the specific ways that unrehearsed important things failed. He had his words. He used them. He spoke about the will of fire with the careful, genuine delivery of someone who believed in a thing and knew the belief was under challenge and was choosing to present it honestly rather than rhetorically. He spoke about what Konoha had meant, not its failures. He didn't pretend they didn't exist. Kakashi was too honest for that, but its intention. The intention of protection, of legacy, of something passed from one generation to the next, that meant the sacrifice of one generation was not wasted. He spoke about Naruto's place in that. The dream. The path that had been visible from the moment a loud, orange-clad genin had stood on a bridge and refused to give up on a teammate who hadn't asked to be given up on. He spoke for a long time. Naruto listened. This was the first thing that undid Sakura quietly, without her showing it. The Naruto she had known was a poor listener, not from stupidity or selfishness, but from the overflow of his own processing, the way his own thoughts rushed to respond before the other person had finished. He had been the person who interrupted not to dominate but to engage, to show that he was already there with you, already working on it, already in motion. The person across from them listened with the completeness of something that had all the time it would ever need and was in no hurry to spend any of it. When Kakashi finished, there was a pause. Then Naruto spoke. "The will of fire," he said, "is a story." Not dismissively, precisely. It's a good story as stories go. It has the elements that make people willing to sacrifice. Continuity, the idea that what you give up will persist in the next generation. Belonging, the idea that you are part of something larger than yourself. Purpose, the idea that the thing you're part of is worth being part of. He looked at Kakashi steadily. Good stories don't have to be lies to be incomplete. Kakashi held his gaze. What's incomplete about it? The part where you look at what the story costs and who pays for it. Naruto's voice remained even. I was born on October 10th. My father died sealing a weapon into me. My mother died from the extraction that made the sealing possible. The village was told to keep me alive because I was useful, and to keep their hatred of what I carried quiet because it was inconvenient. Then they sent me to an academy that trained children to be soldiers. Then they sent me on missions where I could be killed. Then they gave me harder missions and harder enemies and harder wars, and every time I survived they called it the will of fire, as if the fire was the point and not the burning. He paused. When I was 12 years old, he continued, I wanted to be Hokage more than I wanted anything. I wanted it because I had been told that the Hokage was the person the village acknowledged, the person they saw. I had spent 12 years being invisible in a village of people who could see me. I didn't want power. I wanted the acknowledgment to mean something. I wanted to matter to the people who had decided I didn't. A silence. Do you understand what that is? He asked, not rhetorically. That's a child who has been failed by his community, trying to earn his way into being allowed to belong to it. That's the will of fire. It produces people who are so hungry for the village's approval that they will walk into any danger the village points them toward, because the danger is the price of the belonging. And the village never has to examine whether the price is just, because the child is paying it voluntarily. Kakashi was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that a man maintains when he is holding something that wants to surface and is deciding whether the surface is the right place for it. You're not wrong, he said finally, about the system, about what it costs and who pays. I know, Naruto said. Simply, not triumphantly, but the people in it, Kakashi continued. The people who loved you inside it, they weren't the system. Something shifted in Naruto's expression, not breaking, not warming, something more complex. The expression of someone who has considered this argument extensively and found it both true and insufficient. No, he said, they weren't. And that's the hardest part of what I'm saying. The people weren't the system. Iruka wasn't the system, you weren't the system. Old man Hokage wasn't the system, not personally. He paused. But good people inside a broken system don't fix the system. They make it bearable, and something bearable is very easy to never get around to fixing. Kakashi had no answer for this. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who are looking at the same object from different positions and have discovered that both views are accurate, and that this accuracy does not resolve the distance between them. Sakura asked the question she had come to ask in the 38th minute of the conversation. She had been holding it since they entered the room. She had listened to Kakashi and Naruto dismantle, and examined the philosophical architecture of the world they had grown up in with the attention she usually gave to complex medical diagnoses, trying to find the place where she could intervene, where her presence in the conversation could accomplish something that the conversation wasn't already accomplishing on its own. She had not found that place. The conversation was complete without her. It was doing what it needed to do. So she asked the only question she had that the conversation wasn't answering. Do you miss it? She said. Any of it? Both men looked at her. Kakashi with something like relief, the relief of a third option appearing in a two-option situation. Naruto with the specific attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, turned fully toward the thing it was considering, a silence. Naruto looked at the window. at the overcast sky beyond it, pressing down with comfortable permanence. She watched his face in profile, unchanged still, the whisker marks she had known since she was 12 years old, and waited. "I miss the ramen," he said 3 seconds. His profile for exactly those seconds was 17 years old. Not performed, not recalled, actually 17. Actually in the specific moment of a person who ate ramen alone at a counter and thought it was the best thing in the world, because for that hour it was the best thing in his world. The years fell away from his expression without drama, without announcement, and sat there in the room with them. Then they returned. The stillness resettled. The depth came back behind his eyes. He was himself again, fully, permanently himself. But Sakura had seen it. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you know you cannot keep. "Just the ramen?" Kakashi asked, quietly. "The ramen," Naruto said, "and other things I don't have the right words for anymore." He turned from the window. "The words I had for them were in a language I was speaking when I was someone who needed them. I'm not sure that language translates." Kakashi stood at the room's door in the conversation's final minutes. He had said what he came to say. He had not accomplished what he came to accomplish. Naruto was not coming back, was not reachable through appeals to the past, was not recoverable in the way that the Hokage's office had used the word recover in the mission briefing. Kakashi had known this before he arrived. He had come anyway, because there was a difference between knowing something and having experienced it, and he had needed to experience this. He was experiencing it. "Are you happy?" he asked. He stopped at the door and asked it without turning around, because some questions were easier to ask at a door than at a face. The pause was longer than the ramen pause. It had a different quality, not accessing memory, but genuinely working through a concept that had become complex. "I am correct," Naruto said finally. "Everything I am is in its right place. I am doing what I exist to do." Another pause. I think happy requires something to compare itself to, a before and an after. I don't have a before anymore, not in the way that comparison requires. I am simply what I am, doing what I do." He paused once more. "I think you're asking about something I no longer have the capacity to feel, not because it was taken from me, because I grew into something that doesn't have the aperture for it." Kakashi nodded. Once. The slow nod of someone accepting an answer they don't like and are choosing to accept anyway, because the alternative is not accepting things, and he had learned the cost of that. "Kakashi-sensei," Naruto said. Kakashi stopped. "You taught me that those who abandon their teammates are worse than scum." The words came from somewhere very deep in the conversation, from the layer underneath the philosophy and the politics and the grief. The actual layer. The one that had been 12 years old and wanted to belong to something. "I didn't abandon mine, I just finally understood who my teammates actually were." A pause. "The land," Kakashi said, carefully. "The court." "Them," Naruto agreed, "and something older, something that chose me before I had a name." He paused. "I was on a team my whole life. I just didn't know which one until I found the one that recognized me first." Kakashi stood at the door for a moment longer. Then he walked through it, back into the corridor that had decided to lead him where he needed to go. Back through a fortress that operated on rules that had been old when the world was new. He did not look back. He had learned, across a lifetime of loss, that looking back at things you could not change was a particular kind of harm you did to yourself, and he had done enough of that for one life. Sakura caught up to him in the corridor. They walked in silence for a while. The fortress's spatial geometry rearranged itself ahead of them. The path out was clear, unambiguous, the structure's cooperation in their departure as absolute as its resistance to their arrival had been welcoming. "He's not coming back," she said. "Not a question. No. Was there ever a version of this conversation that ended differently?" Kakashi considered this honestly. It was the question worth considering, not because the answer would change anything, but because Kakashi valued honest accounting of the past even when the past was recent and still warm. "I don't think so," he said. I think he left the gate knowing what he was going toward, and I think everything that happened in there was him having already arrived. He was quiet for a moment. I think we came to say goodbye. We just needed to discover that in the room. Sakura absorbed this. He misses the ramen, she said. Yes, she stopped, started again. That's the most Naruto thing I've ever heard and also the saddest thing I've ever heard, and I can't figure out how to hold both of those at once. You don't hold them at once, Kakashi said. You alternate. You hold one and then the other, and eventually they're both just part of what you know, and knowing them doesn't require holding them anymore. She looked at him. How long does that take? I'll let you know when I get there, he said. 3 days after Kakashi and Sakura returned to Konoha, the village's administrative apparatus registered a missing person report filed by Kurenai Yuhai's neighbors, who had not seen her in 2 days. The report was routed to Anbu Standard Protocol. Shinobi of her rank didn't simply disappear without a mission assignment, which meant her disappearance was either a mission that hadn't been logged, an accident, or a choice. Her apartment told the story of a choice. Not a hurried one, the apartment was clean as Kurenai maintained it normally, a woman of precise domestic habits that expressed the same control she brought to her genjutsu work. Her mission gear was gone. Her personal effects were gone. Her teaching materials, her books, the photograph on her desk of her team, gone. The Jonin vest was on the bed. Folded, not discarded. The fold was careful, the same fold Anbu and Jonin used when they were laying equipment down that they intended to treat with respect, even while leaving it behind. It was not the gesture of someone throwing something away. It was the gesture of someone acknowledging what something had been while making clear they were not taking it with them. Kakashi, when the report reached his desk, looked at it for a long time. He had known Kurenai since they were young. She was sharp, loyal, deeply principled, a woman who had spent her career teaching children to survive in the shinobi system with something of their humanity intact. He thought about what might have occurred in the 3 weeks between the gate and now that he hadn't seen. What accumulations! What final reckonings! He filed the report and said nothing about the fold in the vest. In the land of silence, in a chamber that was not the throne room and not the diplomatic hall but something between, a space the fortress had produced for a specific kind of conversation, Kurenai Yuhai stood in front of the sovereign and held out her wrist. "Do it," she said. She had arrived that morning. She had crossed the border without resistance, been shown to this room by Komori, who had looked at her with the comprehensive assessment of his intelligence-strained observation, and found, apparently, nothing that required intervention. She had waited. She was good at waiting. Genjutsu required patience, required the willingness to hold a constructed reality steady for as long as it needed to hold. Naruto entered the room and looked at her. He had met Kurenai twice before, once during the Chunin exams, when she had been Hinata's Jonin sensei, and he had been the loud genin making promises in the corridor. And once after the war at a ceremony he had attended in the specific mode of attending ceremonies without being present for them. He did not know her well. He knew her the way you know people who have been in the periphery of your life, their shape, their quality, not their interior. He looked at her now. She was in her 30s, dark-haired, red-eyed, a genjutsu specialist of considerable ability who had spent her career working with precision and care. She was holding out her wrist with the steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was past the point of deciding. "Why?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected, because she had expected to have to explain and had prepared to explain, and the question's simplicity arrived before the explanation was ready, she told him. The room was private. The corridor outside was empty. The walls of the fortress absorbed sound with the thoroughness of pre-chakra geology that had been absorbing things for longer than sound had existed. We do not hear what Kurenai says. We see Naruto listen. We see his expression during the listening, the absolute attention, the stillness, the depth. We see the moment, somewhere in the middle of what she says, when something moves through his face that is not compassion in the human register, Compassion requires the warmth that he has acknowledged no longer being fully capable of, but something adjacent to it. Something that functions similarly. The recognition of a grief that mirrors your own, seen from the outside by someone who is no longer able to feel grief directly, but can remember its exact shape. She finishes. The room is quiet. Naruto looks at her wrist, still extended, still steady, a woman who has made a decision and is holding it in the air between them until something happens to it. "You understand what you lose," he said. It was not a warning, it was verification. "I understand what I've already lost," she said. "This is a question about what I become." Another pause. "The genjutsu will change," he said. "What you currently do with perception manipulation will go deeper, into blood, into biological memory. It will be more powerful and less reversible. The people you use it on will not recover what you take from them, I know. You were a teacher," he said. "You spent your career trying to give people the tools to survive with their humanity intact." "Yes," she said. The past tense sat in the word without her placing it there. It landed on its own. "And the system I was teaching them to survive in was the same system that—" She stopped, reorganized. "I taught them to be good soldiers for something that used soldiers the way I was used. I spent 15 years making the machine run more humanely. The machine is still the machine." Naruto looked at her for a long moment, then he reached out and took her wrist. The primordial blood moved through the contact with the completeness of water finding its level, not forced, not dramatic, simply filling what was ready to receive it. Kurenai felt her chakra network shift at its foundation, the way a building shifts when something fundamental to its structure is replaced. Her genjutsu, the elaborate, chakra-threaded perception craft she had spent her career developing, recalibrated around the new foundation. The same instrument, reading the world through different light. When it was done, she stood in the room and breathed for a moment, taking the measure of herself. The sourceless light of the fortress touched her face. Her red eyes were darker now, not in color, in depth. The same depth that lived behind Naruto's blue, something that could look into a person's blood and read what was written there. "Welcome to the court," Naruto said. She stood straight. "What do you need from me?" He turned toward the door. "What do you have that my court doesn't?" She thought about it. "Children," she said. "I know how children become what they become. I know what the system does to them before they're old enough to choose." She paused. "If you're going to change the system, you need to know where it starts." He stopped at the door. "Then that's what I need," he said. He left. Kurenai Yuhai stood in the chamber in the fortress in the land of silence and felt, for the first time in 15 years, that she was standing in the right place for the right reason. Outside the window, the overcast sky held. The pre-chakra geology breathed its slow, millennial breath. The land settled around a sovereignty that was learning, slowly, what it was going to build. And in Konoha, in a Hokage's office, Kakashi read a missing person report and looked at the line about the folded vest and understood, without being able to say how he understood, that Kurenai had not been lost. She had, in the specific way of people who had been paying attention, found. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Silence Before the Siege. The summit was held in the Land of Iron. This was traditional, neutral ground, administered by samurai whose loyalty ran to the feudal structure rather than any of the 5 villages. A place where the great nations could speak plainly, without the specific anxieties that came from being on another nation's territory. The samurai of the Land of Iron had hosted 4 major summits in the past decade. They were good at it. They provided security, neutrality, excellent tea, and the particular social architecture of a space designed to make difficult conversations feel procedural rather than desperate. The 5th summit did not feel procedural. The 5 Kage arrived within 6 hours of each other over 2 days. Tsunade from Konoha, the 5th Kazekage Gara from Suna, the 4th Reikage from Kumo, the 5th Mizukage Mei Terumi from Kiri, and the 3rd Tsuchikage Anoki from Iwa. They arrived with their advisors, their security details, their carefully maintained expressions of controlled concern. and the private knowledge that every intelligence report from the Land of Silence's surrounding territory for the past 6 months had been either incomplete, contradictory, or mysteriously truncated in its final pages. The meeting lasted 3 days. On the first day, they reviewed the intelligence. This took longer than it should have, because the intelligence required extended discussion to establish what it actually said, since what it appeared to say was frequently in conflict with what intelligence was supposed to be capable of saying. The Sensory Division reports. The Sealing Master's analysis. The economic data showing 14 minor nations in active defection from great nation tributary systems. The Biju stability reports, which the Jinchuriki present had confirmed independently. All 9-tailed beasts had been exhibiting low-level disturbance for 18 months, a persistent sub-threshold agitation that none of the Jinchuriki's internal communications with their beasts had produced satisfying explanations for. Juki, when B had asked directly, had said, "It is like standing near a very old fire. We are not cold. We are simply aware of being cold things near something that is warm in a way we do not have the biology for." This was not an intelligence report that the council table knew what to do with. On the second day, they discussed options. The options were essentially: engage diplomatically, accept the new territorial reality, or act militarily. The diplomatic option had been tried. The envoy's report sat in the center of the table, a document that each Kage had read, and none of them had been satisfied by. Primarily because the most consequential sentence in it was "Your nations may continue to exist," which was not a sentence any of them had ever received from a diplomatic context, and which none of their existing frameworks satisfactorily accommodated. Accepting the new territorial reality meant accepting the defection of 14 nations, the ongoing disruption of established tributary systems, and the precedent that a single sovereign entity could establish a sphere of influence the great nation's combined intelligence apparatus couldn't effectively monitor. It meant accepting that somewhere in the Land of Silence there existed a presence that left no chakra trace, operated below every detection threshold they had, and had apparently been reshaping the geopolitics of the minor nations through a gravity-based economic model that the great nations could not replicate without dismantling their own resource requirements. Anoki, the oldest of the 5 Kage, had looked at this option for a long time and said, with the bluntness of a man who had reached the age at which bluntness was its own diplomatic tool, "If we accept it now, we accept it forever. An entity that does not age has no reason to limit itself if we demonstrate that we will accommodate its expansion." The military option had then dominated the remainder of the second day and all of the third. Shikamaru Nara had been given the tactical lead. He had not requested it. He had been assigned it by Tsunade with the specific logic of. He was the best strategic mind currently available. He had reviewed more of the Land of Silence intelligence than anyone else in the village, and if anyone could produce a viable military approach to this problem, it was the person who had been thinking about problems from the age of 8, with the consistent conclusion that most problems were more complicated than they appeared. He had spent 3 weeks in a room in Konoha's strategic planning division doing nothing but reading. Every Anbu report in chronological order, from the first confused filing to the most recent. Every diplomatic communique. Every economic analysis of the minor nation defections. Every Biju stability report. The envoy's full documentation, including the addenda that hadn't made the summary version, Ren's sealing analysis, the sensory specialist's raw data, Killer B's verse draft that the Rakeage's office had attached with a note that said included for completeness, in a tone that implied the Rakeage was still uncertain whether to be grateful or appalled. He read B's verse draft 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time because the 4th reading was when you caught what the 3rd reading had almost caught. He produced, after 3 weeks, a strategic assessment that was 4 pages long. 3.5 pages of analysis, half a page of recommendation. The recommendation read, "We should not do this." The operational premise of a military engagement requires that the target can be located, engaged, and affected by the forces brought against it. We currently have no reliable mechanism for any of these three requirements. The Land of Silence's territory disrupts chakra-based detection at every range we have tested. The Sovereign himself registers as absent on every sensor system we operate. Our most powerful techniques have demonstrated degradation in proximity to his presence. Our Biju are destabilized by proximity to his territory. A military engagement against an entity that cannot be detected, cannot be engaged through chakra-based means, and has demonstrated the ability to spatially rearrange approach routes, conducted in territory that disrupts the fundamental energy system our entire military apparatus is built on, is not a military engagement. It is a delivery mechanism for casualties. I recommend against this course of action. If the Council wishes to proceed regardless, I will plan the best possible campaign within these constraints. But the constraints do not permit a best possible campaign. They permit a least catastrophic one. The Council read this assessment. They overruled it. Shikamaru accepted this. He was a strategist, not a decision-maker. The distinction mattered to him, had always mattered to him, because the distinction was what allowed him to do his job well when his job required planning things he thought were wrong. He took the overruling and returned to his room and planned the least catastrophic campaign he could build within constraints that did not permit a good outcome. He was good at this. He had always been good at making the best of situations he disapproved of. He had concluded sometime in his mid-20s, the core competency of intelligence in a world that ran on decisions made by people with more authority than information. The assessment was 4 pages. He wrote a fifth. The 5th page was not strategy. It was addressed to no one and contained no intelligence value, and he was going to burn it before he left the room, which meant it could say what the previous 4 pages could not. He wrote, "We built this world on sending children to war and calling it duty. I have known this since I was old enough to understand what the word mission meant for a genin. I spent my career working inside a system I knew was broken, because I told myself that working inside it was more useful than standing outside it. That the friction of someone intelligent and dissenting inside the machine produced better outcomes than the machine running without friction. I don't know if that was true. I know it was convenient to believe. There was a boy in my class at the academy who was louder than anyone needed him to be and worse at the things the academy measured and better at the things the academy didn't measure. He believed in things with his whole body. Not with his mind was a mess. His grades proved it, but with the part of a person that belief lives in before the mind has learned to moderate it. He believed that the village would eventually see him. He believed that if he worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough, the world would give him the thing he wanted. He wanted to be seen. The village that raised him decided, when he was 3 days old, that what he carried made him too dangerous to fully see. And then it spent 12 years training him to protect it and called that love. I wonder sometimes what kind of strategist he would have been if anyone had actually looked at him. He saw things. Not clearly, not trained clearly, but he saw the shape of situations in a way that I recognized and that nobody around him recognized because they were too busy not looking. He's not coming back. I know that. I've known it since I read the envoy report. The person who wanted to be Hokage is not there anymore. What's there is something that has finished wanting, which is either the worst possible outcome or the most honest possible outcome, depending on what you think wanting was worth. I don't know what I think. I know that tomorrow I'm going to march the largest military coalition since the last war toward a border that we should not cross, to engage an entity that we cannot engage, for reasons that are about our fear of what happens if we don't rather than any realistic assessment of what happens if we do. Troublesome. He was always troublesome. Even when he was 10 years old, eating by himself at Ikaraku's and talking to the old man behind the counter about nothing in particular. Even then, I hope the ramen was worth it. Wherever it is he is now, he read it once, he burned it. He picked up the campaign plans and walked out of the room and did not look back. Ugh. The Allied Shinobi force assembled over 20 days. It was the largest organized military deployment in a generation. Every village committing forces at a level that had previously required an existential threat to motivate. The Five Kage had framed it exactly that way in their addresses to their respective populations. Existential threat, the language of something that would not stop unless stopped. The vocabulary of a world that understood warfare in terms of the thing coming for you rather than the thing you were choosing to approach. Shikamaru organized the force with the precision that was his primary mode of engagement with the world. He assigned units, coordinated logistics, planned approach vectors, established communication lines, built redundancy into every system the force would rely on. He did all of this with complete professional attention, and the private knowledge that the approach vectors assumed spatial consistency that the Land of Silence had already demonstrated. It was not obligated to maintain. He built the redundancy anyway. Good planning required it. Planning for the possibility that the plan was wrong required it even more. The Jinchuriki were assigned to a separate coordinated unit, all available, all present. The Biju's combined power, representing the single largest concentration of chakra the shinobi world could produce. B commanded the unit at his own request, because B had been to the Land of Silence, had sat in the throne room, had bumped fists with something ancient, and had spent 18 months thinking about what he had touched and what it meant, and what you did with the knowledge that you were about to send people towards something that you understood and they did not. He had written many verses about this. He had shared none of them. On the night before the march, the Jinchuriki unit made camp together, the 7 assembled Jinchuriki. Their Biju present in the way Biju were always present, that heavy internal companionship of a vast entity occupying the same space as a human nervous system. They ate together. They talked, the way soldiers talk before engagements they are not certain of. Some of them had fought together before, some were meeting as allied forces for the first time. Juki was quiet inside B's seal. Had been quiet specifically and unusually since the march orders came down. You've been thinking, B said, in the seal space where their conversations lived. Yes, Juki said, about him, about what he is. A pause. I have existed for longer than most things that currently exist. I have seen the world change. I have a memory that goes back to before Kaguya, before the God Tree, before chakra made everything what it currently is. Another pause longer. I have never in all of that time encountered the thing I touched through his blood. I have only known of it the way you know of something in the oldest part of your memory, not as a thing experienced, but as a thing ancestral. A thing that was before you were, is it a threat? B asked. That question, Juki said, assumes a category relationship between it and us that I'm not certain exists. A mountain is not a threat to a person standing on it. It simply is. The person's survival depends on understanding what a mountain is and behaving accordingly. And what are we doing? A very long silence. Climbing the mountain, Juki said finally, and calling it a battle. B sat with this for the rest of the night, looking at the dark above the tent, listening to the sounds of an army preparing itself for morning. Kurama, inside Naruto's seal, felt the army assembling the way you feel weather changing, not through direct perception, but through a shift in the quality of the atmosphere around you. The pre-chakra geology of the Land of Silence absorbed environmental information in the way that very old things absorb things, completely, without editorial, laying it down in layers the way sediment lays down. The approach of 60,000 shinobi left a signature in the world's old memory that Naruto read through the geology as naturally as reading a page. He said nothing about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, Kurama surfaced a memory. This was not a thing the fox did often, had done, in fact, exactly twice before in their shared history. The second room's establishment had changed the terms of their coexistence in ways that gradually modified behavior. Kurama could not lend chakra anymore, could not manifest, could not reach through the seal in any of the ways a tailed beast traditionally asserted itself within a Jinchuriki. What he could do, and had discovered he could do when the primordial connection reorganized the seal's architecture, was surface memories with a precision that bypassed Naruto's conscious filtering, not implanting, not altering, simply selecting a memory from the shared record of their coexistence and presenting it to Naruto's awareness with the clarity of immediate experience rather than the softness of recollection. He chose carefully. He had been choosing this memory for 3 months, since the march orders had first become information in the fortress's intelligence network. He had sat with the choice, examining it from multiple angles, determining whether it was the right choice or the self-interested choice, or whether those were the same thing or different things. He surfaced it. 7-year-old Naruto on the roof of his apartment building. An autumn evening, the village harvest festival in the streets below, the lights, the music, the specific warm noise of a community celebrating together. Not the rooftop specifically for the festival view. Just the rooftop, because Naruto spent a lot of time on rooftops. High enough that the parts of the village that reminded him he was unwanted were smaller. He had a rice bowl. He had made it himself, badly, the shape was wrong. The seaweed was applied unevenly. The seasoning was probably off because he had used too much of what he had and not enough of what he didn't have. He ate it sitting cross-legged at the roof's edge, watching the festival lights from above, listening to the music from a distance that made it pretty without making it painful. And he smiled, not performing happiness. Not the loud grin he deployed as armor, the aggressive cheerfulness that said, "I am fine, I am very fine, please notice how fine I am." This was quiet, private, the smile of someone who had found a moment that was actually genuinely good and was in it fully, without anyone watching. Kurama presented this memory without commentary. Naruto sat with it for a long time. Then, "Thank you, Kurama," the fox said nothing for a moment. That boy, he finally said. He deserved more than what he got. Yes, Naruto said, he deserved to grow up without having to fight for the right to exist. Yes. Do you, Kurama stopped, started again. Do you remember what it felt like, to want things, to be hungry for things, not in the way of strategy or sovereignty, the way of a child who just wanted someone to be glad he was there, a pause that went very deep into the seal's quiet architecture. I remember the shape of it, Naruto said. The way you remember a room you lived in a long time ago, the dimensions, where the light came from, what it smelled like. He paused. I can't feel the temperature of it anymore, but I remember that it had one. Kurama was quiet. They're coming, Naruto said. 60,000. The full coalition. Every cage. I know. Are you going to tell me not to hurt them? Another long pause. The specific pause of something choosing between several true things and finding that the most important true thing is also the hardest one to say. I'm going to tell you, Kurama said slowly, that the boy on the roof would not have wanted them dead. He would have wanted them to understand something. A pause. Whether that's still relevant to what you want, I don't know. I'm not certain you want things the way he did. But I know that you remember what wanting felt like. And I know that you surfaced his memory because it still means something, even if you can't feel its temperature. You're asking me to be merciful. I'm asking you to remember who taught you what mercy was, Kurama said. Before the system. Before the war. Before any of it. A pause. Uruka, crying in a forest clearing, putting his body between you and a sword. He wasn't doing that for the will of fire. He was doing it because you were worth it. Because you personally, Naruto Uzumaki, were worth protecting. And then I want you to decide what you do with that. Naruto sat in the pre-dawn dark of the fortress and held this. Outside, the overcast sky held its permanent position. The geology breathed. The land of silence maintained its condition. He sent for his court. The court assembled in the throne room within the hour. Komori, Jigoku, Yamagiri, Kurenai, and the newest addition. a former Sanjonin named Sari, compact and precise, who had come to the land of silence 8 months ago with a mission that had been abandoned somewhere in a 4-hour conversation, and who now ran the fortress's internal security with the thoroughness of someone who had learned, through direct experience, that thoroughness was the only security. Naruto stood before the throne rather than sitting in it. This was noted by every court member. The position communicated something specific, the differentiation between the formal mode of governance and what this was. The Allied force is 3 days from the border, he said. 60,000. All 5 Kage, every available Jinchuriki. The court absorbed this. Jigoku, whose response to information was physical, shifted his weight. The floor cracked slightly beneath his foot. Komori's expression did not change. It never did. But his eyes moved in the specific pattern of someone whose threat assessment architecture was running at full capacity. Kurenai looked at Naruto with the specific attention she had spent 15 years training herself to give to situations before she responded to them. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Stay here," Naruto said, a pause. "I'll handle this alone," he said. The silence that followed was the silence of 5 people who were not ordinary people processing something that would have been, for ordinary people, straightforwardly absurd. Yamagiri spoke first. She always spoke first when the court was silent too long. A century of filling silences that needed filling had made it instinct. "Is this wisdom or demonstration?" she asked, not critically. As a genuine classificatory question, the way a scholar establishes parameters before analysis. "Demonstration," Naruto said, "but not for the purpose of spectacle." He paused. "They need to understand what they're facing before they can accept any arrangement with it. You can't negotiate from understanding if the understanding hasn't arrived yet. I could send the court. They would fight. People would die on both sides, and the survivors would go home with fear rather than understanding, and fear produces the next war rather than preventing it." "And you alone produces understanding?" Komori asked. "I alone produces an experience they don't have a military response to," Naruto said, "which is the prerequisite for understanding." He looked at each of them in turn, the assessment of a sovereign who knew his court, who had spent 2 years building these relationships with the patience of something that was not running out of time. "What I'm going to do out there ends one way. I want you here because what comes after, the administration of that outcome, is what you're for, not this part." Yamagiri looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded. The nod of someone who has done the assessment and found it sound, not the nod of someone deferring. The others followed. "One instruction," Naruto said before he turned to leave. He looked at Kurenai specifically. "The children, whatever we build after, you said you know where the system starts. Start drawing the map." He paused. "We'll need it." Kurenai's expression did something complex. "Already started," she said. "He left." The Allied shinobi force reached the border of the Land of Silence on the morning of the 21st day. Shikamaru had organized the approach with his standard precision. The formation was structured for maximum tactical flexibility. The advance units in sensor priority configuration, the heavy assault units staged at intervals that allowed coordinated response to defensive contact. He had planned the approach for an entity that could rearrange spatial relationships. So he had built in constant triangulation protocols, landmark verification checkpoints every 100 meters, and a communication relay system that didn't rely on chakra transmission, because he had read the Sealing Master's report about what happened to chakra-based systems in the territory. The approach proceeded normally for 40 minutes. Then the sensory division lead, a Suna specialist named Cho, reported to Shikamaru. "I've got a single reading, dead center of the road, 1 kilometer inside the border." Shikamaru stopped the column. "Signature?" he asked. "That's what I'm trying to tell you," Cho said. Her voice had the specific quality of a professional whose instrument was producing results she didn't know how to present. "There's no signature. I know someone is there. I can feel the absence of signature, which shouldn't be a detectable thing, but it is." It's like a hole in the sensor field, the shape of a person-sized void where a person-sized presence should register. How certain are you that it's him? Shikamaru asked. Cho was quiet for a moment. 100%, she said. I don't know how I'm 100% certain of something I can't read, but I am. Shikamaru looked at the road ahead. 60,000 people arranged behind him, the full military capability of the 5 great nations, every cage present. He had planned a campaign he didn't believe in for 3 weeks, and had burned a page about it, and had marched 21 days, and had done all of this correctly and professionally. And now he was standing at a border looking at a report of a presence-shaped absence 1 kilometer up the road. He thought about the verse in B's diplomatic report. He's not trying to be Hokage anymore, bro. He's trying to be everything the Hokage ever bowed to. He thought about a boy who ate ramen by himself and wanted to be seen. Formation hold, he said. I'm going forward to the sensory line. He walked to the front of the column. Through 60,000 people arranged in tactical formation, all of them watching him walk. All of them doing the professional suppression of the thing that 60,000 people felt simultaneously when the moment of an engagement approached. He reached the formation's front line. He looked up the road. Naruto was standing in it, 1 kilometer inside the border, exactly as Cho had reported. No court, no guard, no formation, no preparation, no visible armor or weapon or any of the physical vocabulary of a military engagement. Just a person standing in a road in the pre-dawn light, hands at his sides, watching 60,000 people arrange themselves in front of him with the patience of something that has been watching things arrange themselves for longer than arrangements had existed. One of the sensory specialists beside Shikamaru said, in a voice smaller than she intended, "He's smiling." Shikamaru looked. He could not see the smile from this distance. The kilometer between them was real distance, not blood cartography, not spatial manipulation. But Cho confirmed it, with the specific certainty she'd had about everything she reported that morning. "He's smiling," she said. Shikamaru stood at the head of 60,000 people and looked at one person standing in a road and thought about everything he had burned and everything he had planned, and everything he had not been able to say in any document that would survive his authorship. Behind him, the allied shinobi force waited. Ahead, the land of silence held its condition, overcast, geological, ancient in the way of things that had been ancient before the word existed. Shikamaru took a breath. "Hold the formation," he said. "Nobody moves until I say." He looked at the road, at the figure in it, at the kilometer between them that contained, somehow, every question the shinobi world had been too busy running to ask itself. Troublesome, he thought. Absolutely, completely troublesome. The morning held. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Eternal Eclipse. The kilometer between them lasted forever. Not literally. Shikamaru's internal clock, which was precise enough to function as a mission instrument, told him the formation held for approximately 4 minutes before the Five Kage reached the front line. 4 minutes of 60,000 people breathing the pre-chakra air of the land of silence's border, while a single figure stood in the road ahead and watched them with the patience of something that had been watching things since before watching had a name. 4 minutes was long enough for a quality to settle over the assembled force that Shikamaru had no tactical term for. It was not fear. He had been in enough pre-engagement situations to know the texture of collective fear, and this was not it. It was something more fundamental than fear. Fear was a response to a threat you could calibrate. What 60,000 shinobi felt, standing in the border air of the land of silence, was the response of things that had been calibrated by a specific system their entire lives, suddenly standing in proximity to something the system had no measurement for. The Biju felt it first and most completely. Inside their respective seals, all 7 present-tailed beasts registered the proximity simultaneously, not as a threat assessment, not as the combat readiness spike that preceded engagement, but as the deepest possible form of environmental awareness. The recognition of an ancestor. something so foundationally prior to their existence that their instincts, honed across millennia, simply had no behavioral protocol for it. The Biju did not become afraid. They became still in a way that had nothing to do with restraint and everything to do with the response of very old things in the presence of something older. Their Jinchuriki felt it as a sudden, sourceless weight, not crushing, settling. The weight of geological time pressing down through the seals from the Biju's awareness into their host's physical experience. B felt Juki go absolutely silent, not the communicative silence of the beast choosing not to speak, the silence of something that has been waiting its whole existence to be in this proximity and is now fully occupied by the experience of it. He stood in the Jinchuriki formation and breathed through it. The Five Kage arrived at the front line. Tsunade looked at the figure in the road and held herself with the specific steadiness of a woman who had survived things that should have broken her and had decided, somewhere in the accumulation of those survivals. That steadiness was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. She felt things about Naruto Uzumaki. She had always felt things about him, had watched him grow up in the specific way that people who are trying not to get attached watch things they are attached to, which is to say imperfectly and with frequent evidence of the attachment in unguarded moments. She looked at him now and felt the complexity of someone looking at a person they loved in a form that the love had not prepared them for. Gaara stood beside her. The fifth Kage was still, was always still. The specific stillness of someone who had survived his own version of being unwanted and unloved, and had built something quieter and more durable than loudness from the other side of it. He looked at the figure in the road and recognized something, in the abstract way of someone who understood what it meant to have been the thing your community feared before you became the thing your community needed. He said nothing. He was good at knowing when nothing was the right thing to say. The Raikage, beside him, was not good at knowing this. He stood with the contained energy of a man whose primary engagement mode was force and who was currently in a situation where force had no obvious application point. His jaw was working. He had read the envoy's report 17 times and had found 17 different reasons to believe that the situation was still within the operational parameters of things he understood. And he had believed them for 17 readings and was finding, standing at this border, that the 18th reading had arrived whether he was ready for it or not. Anoki floated. He was old enough to float rather than walk without it being theatrical. His body had earned the accommodation. He looked at the figure in the road with the eyes of a man who had been alive long enough to see many things become permanent that people had assumed were temporary, and many things collapse that people had assumed were permanent. His expression was unreadable in the way of very old things that have learned to keep their readings internal. Mei Terumi looked at the road and the figure and the land beyond and was running behind her composed exterior, the most thorough environmental assessment her considerable capabilities permitted. Her Keke Toda was sensitive to composition, to the material properties of things, to what things were made of at a level below their surface presentation. She was reading the land of silence's border air and finding, in its composition, something that she had no category for. Not chakra. Not the absence of chakra. Something that her senses could detect and could not name, the way you can detect a color that exists outside the visible spectrum without being able to say what color it is. "He's not moving," one of the advance unit commanders reported. Unnecessary information, everyone could see he wasn't moving, but delivered in the compulsive way that people report things when standing still feels worse than talking. Shikamaru looked at the cage. "Your call," he said. Because it was, and because stating it clearly was the only honest thing left to do. Tsunade looked at the figure in the road for a long moment. Then she stepped forward. She walked the kilometer alone. The formation behind her held. Shikamaru had given no order to follow, and everyone understood that the cage walking forward alone was itself an order. the order of someone choosing to approach something on terms that acknowledged what the something was rather than pretending those terms were negotiable. The kilometer was real distance. She walked it in the way she walked everything, directly, without performance, the gait of a woman who had been afraid of many things in her life, and had concluded that the only productive relationship with fear was forward momentum. The air changed as she approached. Not dramatically, not the sudden environmental shift of a barrier technique. Gradually, the quality of the prechakra static that the sensory specialists had described, resolving itself as she entered its concentration point from a pervasive background condition into something that had texture. It pressed against her chakra network with the gentle consistency of an environment that was not hostile to chakra but was simply older than it, the way the ocean is not hostile to a stone dropped into it. It simply receives. It simply continues. She stopped 10 feet from Naruto. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Naruto," she said. "Tsunade-sama," he said. Not with the specific weight of the honorific as performance, not ironically. Simply accurately she was, to whatever part of him still maintained the records of what people had been to him, the person that title described. "I'm not going to pretend this is anything other than what it is," she said. "Good," he said. "Pretending is expensive, and we'd both know we were doing it." She looked at him, really looked, the way a medical nin looked, which was a specific and practiced form of attention that went below the surface presentation to the biological reality beneath. She ran the involuntary diagnostic that 20 years of medical practice had built into her observation, and found what the sensory specialists and sealing master had found before her. Nothing standard to read. The biological reality was there. She could see him, could observe the physical person standing in the road, but the underlying energy system that her diagnostic expected to find was absent. Not empty. Other. Running on something that her medical framework could detect as something and could not classify beyond that. "You could have come to us," she said finally, the thing she needed to say before the rest. "I know. We would have listened." Something moved through his expression. Not the ramen expression Sakura had caught, something different. The expression of someone who is being offered something they wanted for a long time, offered after the wanting is gone, and is finding the experience more complex than either the wanting or its absence would have suggested. "Maybe," he said. And maybe the listening would have been the kind that ends with a committee forming and a decision being made by people whose interests weren't aligned with the outcome. He paused. The system had a good track record of listening to problems and solving them in ways that preserved the system. He looked at her steadily. "You're one of the best people the system ever produced, Tsunade-sama. I mean that. And you spent your whole career working around the system's worst impulses from inside it. That's not an argument for the system. That's an argument for you personally." Tsunade was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" she asked, the real question beneath all the other questions. "From you specifically?" he considered. "I want you to watch what happens next and then make decisions based on what you saw rather than what you plan to see." He paused. "That's all I've ever wanted from anyone." She studied him. "And from the force behind me." He looked past her at the assembled formation. 60,000 people in the morning light, the largest military coalition she had ever been part of, arranged against a single person who stood in a road without a guard and looked at them the way a landscape looks at weather passing through. "To understand something," he said, "I can't give them that by explaining it. I have to show them." Tsunade looked at him for a long moment. "Are any of them going to die?" she asked. Directly, because directness was the only currency she had left in this conversation. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. "Not from me," he finally said. "What they do to each other in panic that I can't control. Tell Shikamaru to hold the formation no matter what they see." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the formation, carrying the conversation in her chest in the specific way of someone transporting something fragile that has no container appropriate to its nature. She relayed the instruction to Shikamaru. Hold the formation no matter what. and Shikamaru relayed it through the command structure with the quiet authority of someone whose instructions tended to be followed, because the people following them had learned that the cost of not following Shikamaru's instructions was invariably higher than the cost of following them. The formation held, Naruto stood in the road, and then the second layer surfaced. It did not happen visibly. There was no explosion of energy, no physical transformation, no dark aura expanding in a dramatic ring the way power releases tended to present themselves in the combat language of the shinobi world. What happened was subtler, and in its subtlety more comprehensively disturbing than any of those things would have been. The quality of the light changed. Not the amount, the sun was still in the sky, or was still in the sky where it could be seen above the land of silence's perpetual overcast, and the overcast was still filtering it in the same diffuse way it always did. The quality, the way the light was choosing to behave. It continued to illuminate the scene, but did so in the manner of something performing a function it was no longer fully committed to. The way a sound continues after the source has stopped present, but decreasing in conviction. The pre-chakra static, which had been a background atmospheric condition, stopped being background. It became the foreground. It became the environment itself, not replacing what had been there, but revealing itself to have always been the primary condition beneath the surface condition, the way a tide goes out and reveals what the water was covering, what the world was made of before chakra made it what it currently was. A deep, sourceless, patient dark that had been waiting beneath the surface of everything for the surface to become permeable. Naruto stood in it the way a person stands in their native element. The boundaries of him, which had always been precisely where his physical body ended, became less certain. Not expanding, dissolving at the edges, the way a form dissolves when the medium around it becomes the same substance. He remained visible. Clearly, entirely visible, the same blonde, the same whisker marks, the same specific physical person. But the borders between him and the surrounding environment became a question rather than a statement. Where he ended, and where the primordial condition of the world began, was no longer something the eye could confidently report. The 60,000 people of the allied shinobi force experienced this simultaneously. Not the same experience, the experience scaled to the individual's sensitivity. The shinobi with no particular sensory ability felt a pressure in the chest, a sudden awareness of their own heartbeat in a way that healthy people typically did not feel it. The body's reporting of itself, in a moment when the environment had communicated that the body's continuity was a circumstance rather than a guarantee. The sensory specialists felt it as complete instrumental failure. Every sense they had trained and extended beyond normal human range simply stopped producing readable data. Not static, not overload, cessation, as if the instrument had encountered something so fundamentally prior to what it was designed to measure that it had nothing to say about it. They stood with their extended senses returning nothing, and felt the specific, profound vulnerability of experts deprived of the expertise that made them feel safe. The biju broke. Not violently, not in the way of seals failing or chakra erupting uncontrolled. They broke in the way of very old, very strong things that have encountered something that makes strength irrelevant. All seven-tailed beasts, simultaneously, went still in a way that their Jinchuriki felt as a physical event. The enormous weight of the beast inside simply stopping, fully stopping, the way a vast piece of machinery stops when its power source is interrupted. Juki inside B said one thing. Not in words, in the pre-language of something communicating beneath the level of language. It is what I remembered, the Eight-Tails said. It is what I could not describe. Do you feel it? B felt it. He stood in the Jinchuriki formation and felt Juki's stillness and the weight of the surrounding pre-chakra condition, and thought about bumping fists with something ancient in a throne room, and about what it meant to have been in the presence of this and not have understood the scale of it. He understood the scale of it now. He stayed standing. B was good at staying standing, The 5 Kage at the formation's front held themselves against what hit them, each differently, each through the specific architecture of their own strength. Tsunede's medical training gave her a framework, inadequate but present, for experiencing biological impossibility without breaking. Gaara had sand, and sand responded to the condition by simply settling. There was nothing to protect against, nothing for the sand's defensive instinct to organize around, and so it settled. Anoki felt the age of it and recognized it in the part of himself that was simply very old, and this helped him more than it helped the others. Mei's compositional senses flooded with information she couldn't read, and she shut them down manually and operated on what her basic human senses gave her, which was enough. The Raikage felt it as a force pressing against his lightning nature and pushed back instinctively, because pushing back was what he did, and felt his lightning sputter against something that could not be pushed, because it was not the kind of thing that had a direction to push from. Shikamaru stood very still, in the exact center of a situation he had calculated was catastrophic and had planned for anyway, and let the experience of it arrive without trying to manage it. This was, perhaps, the most tactically intelligent response present. The decision not to expend resource on processing that no processing framework could accomplish. He stood in the primordial condition of the world and thought, with the specific clarity of a mind that found its sharpest focus in its worst moments. This is what we should have been trying to understand for 20 years, instead of trying to contain. Troublesome, he thought. Completely, irreversibly troublesome. Naruto spoke. His voice arrived inside each person simultaneously. Not through the air, not a technique, not amplification, not any mechanism that required sound to travel the intervening distance. It was simply present, the way the primordial condition itself was present, not arriving from outside but surfacing from within, as if the voice had always been there and had only now chosen to be audible. I am going to give you an ending you didn't expect. The formation heard it. 60,000 people, each hearing it as if it came from directly beside them. I'm going to let you leave. The quality of the silence that followed was the silence of 60,000 people discovering simultaneously that the outcome they had braced for was not the outcome that was arriving. Not because I cannot do otherwise, Naruto continued. The voice maintained its sourceless, present quality, not threatening, not gentle, simply actual in the way of things that predated the division between those categories. Because the alternative has no interest for me. A world made empty is not a world governed. It is a condition. I am already a condition. I do not need to replicate myself in the landscape. A pause. The pause of something choosing its next words with the care of an entity that understood words were a concession to the other party's need for them. There are 3 things that will happen after today. I am not asking you to agree to them. I am telling you what they are, and I am giving you the opportunity to administer them yourselves, because a world that administers its own reformation produces better outcomes than one that has reformation imposed on it. The formation waited. First, the land of silence and every territory that has aligned with it is sovereign and permanent. This is not a negotiating position. It is a geographic and political fact that will remain a fact regardless of whether your documents reflect it. The only question is how long your documents take to catch up. Silence. Second, the practice of designating children as military assets before they can meaningfully consent to that designation ends. I am not specifying the mechanism. I am specifying the outcome and a generation's worth of time to achieve it. What you build to replace it is your architecture to design. A pause. I have someone who knows where the system starts. She will be available to the administrative processes that follow today if those processes choose to engage with what she knows. You will recognize her. In the formation, Kakashi heard this and understood. He held it quietly. Third, every Jinchuriki currently living will be given a real choice about their continuation. Not offered as courtesy. Given as a right. administered not by their Kage but by a process independent of the political structures that created the Jinchuriki system. The choice and the full information required to make it belongs to the person who carries the beast, not to the village that weaponized them. The 7 Jinchuriki in the formation heard this in the specific register of people receiving news about themselves, each differently. Some with the stillness of someone who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a specific sentence. Some with the complexity of someone for whom the sentence arrived in a form they hadn't imagined it, heard it, and thought about Juki. About 23 years of the best and most complicated relationship he had ever had. About what it meant to be offered the choice you'd never been given by something that had no stake in your decision and was offering it anyway. What would you choose? He asked Juki. Genuinely asked, not rhetorically, not already knowing the answer. Juki was quiet for a moment. I would choose what we have, the Eight-Tails said, but I would choose it. That's the difference. Yeah, B said, that's the difference. The formation did not engage. Shikamaru had given no order to engage, and the Kage had given no order to engage. And in the absence of those orders, 60,000 shinobi stood in the primordial condition of the world and breathed and held their positions, and did not become the battle they had assembled to be. This was, Shikamaru thought afterward, the single most tactically significant event of his career. 60,000 people choosing not to act in a moment that had spent 3 weeks being prepared as a moment of action. The planning had been for the engagement. The achievement was the non-engagement, and it required more coordination, more discipline, and more collective intelligence than any of the engagement plans he had built. He stepped forward from the formation's front line. Alone. The same step that Tsunade had taken, the same acknowledgment of terms, approaching without pretending the approach was on his terms. He walked the kilometer. Naruto watched him come. When Shikamaru was close enough that speaking didn't require raising his voice, he stopped. He looked at Naruto for a moment, the assessment of a strategist who had spent 3 weeks building models of this person and was now in the presence of the person rather than the model, running the comparison. The model had been inadequate. He had known it would be. I read everything written about you, Shikamaru said. Every intelligence report, every diplomatic record, every mission debrief you were ever part of going back to the academy graduation. Naruto waited. I want you to know, Shikamaru continued, that the picture that produces is not the picture I was shown when I was 12 years old sitting next to you in class. He paused. The picture it produces is of someone who was solving problems the system didn't have the vocabulary to recognize as solutions, who was operating on a logic that the people assessing him didn't have the framework to evaluate correctly. He held Naruto's gaze. You were always the worst student in the class, and you were always the only person in the class who was playing a different game than the one we were being graded on. Something moved through Naruto's expression. Not the ramen expression, different. The expression of someone receiving accurate information about themselves, which was a different experience from receiving flattery and a different experience from receiving criticism, and carried its own specific weight. I didn't know I was playing a different game, Naruto said. I thought I was just losing the one we were all playing. I know, Shikamaru said. That's the part I should have seen at 12 and didn't. He paused. I'm seeing it now. It took 60,000 people and a border crossing. I burned something 3 days ago, Shikamaru said. That should have been enough. It wasn't. He looked at the ground for a moment, the specific pause of a man choosing honesty over strategy because the situation had finally outgrown the usefulness of strategy. Will you accept the terms, all 3? I told you, they aren't terms. They are what is going to happen. Then I'll ask differently. Shikamaru looked up. Will you allow the 5 great nations to be the instrument of their own implementation? Will you let us build it, rather than having it built on top of us? The pause that followed was long. Not uncertain. Naruto was never uncertain in the way of something that hadn't decided yet. Long in the way of something that was deciding whether the decision it had already made was still the right one given what was currently in front of it. Shikamaru, standing in the pause, did not move. He was a patient man when patience was the correct instrument. He had been waiting for this conversation since he burned the page. He could wait a little longer. Yes, Naruto said, one word, carrying the weight of everything that came before it and the weight of everything that would come after. Then we'll build it, Shikamaru said, and meant it with every strategist's instinct he had, which was the most complete meaning he was capable of. The allied shinobi force withdrew in the afternoon. Shikamaru organized the withdrawal with the same precision he had organized the approach, orderly, staged, no unit moving before the adjacent unit was in position. The precision was partly tactical and partly psychological. An orderly withdrawal was the withdrawal of an entity that was choosing to leave. A disorderly withdrawal was the retreat of something that had been defeated. The distinction mattered for the story the returning force would tell, which mattered for the story the five nations would tell themselves, which mattered for whether the thing that happened today could be held in a frame that allowed the five nations to continue functioning afterward. He was always thinking about the story. Strategy was partly the management of events and partly the management of the story events produced. The Five Kage withdrew together, which was itself a statement. Five separate sovereign entities moving as a coordinated body, the kind of coordination that the Land of Iron summits were designed to produce, and that this summit had produced through means that were not standard summit procedure. They moved with the specific quality of people who had experienced something, and were still in the process of becoming the people who had experienced it. Tsunade walked and felt the weight of 3 terms she was going to have to administer, and thought about the machinery of that administration, and thought about what Konoha's academy would look like in a generation if the machinery worked, and thought about a boy who had graduated from that academy, and gone on to become something that the academy had never had a category for. Gaara walked and felt something that might have been relief, and might have been the specific quiet that comes after a tension that has been present so long it stopped feeling like tension. He had been an unwanted child, too. He had built something from that. He looked at the Land of Silence's border from the withdrawing formation and thought about different architectures for the same material, and whether the buildings those architectures produced were comparable. The Raikage walked and said nothing, which was unusual enough that his aides noted it and did not remark on it, and would discuss it quietly among themselves for months afterward. Anoki floated and thought about how long he had been alive, and how the things he had seen that he thought were permanent had changed, and the things he had dismissed as temporary had persisted, and whether there was a lesson in that, or whether the lesson was simply that longevity didn't produce. Wisdom, only perspective, and perspective was only useful if you knew what to do with it. Mei Terumi walked and made a list. It was a mental list of the administrative changes that the 3 terms implied, and the order in which those changes would need to be made, and the political structures that would resist them, and how to organize pressure on those structures, and where the resistance would be weakest. She was a practical woman. She dealt with impossibility by immediately converting it into a logistics problem, because logistics problems had steps, and steps were something you could walk through. The Jinchuriki formation withdrew last. This was B's call, and Shikamaru had not overruled it. B positioned his unit at the formal rear of the withdrawal, which was the position of the formation that faced what you were withdrawing from, and stood in it with the 7 Jinchuriki while the rest of the force moved past. When the last unit had passed and the formation was ready to move, B stood at the border for a moment and looked back at the Land of Silence. The pre-chakra overcast, the geological scars, the distant fortress that was architecturally impossible and existed anyway. The road, empty now, leading to a sovereign who had returned to whatever a sovereign of the primordial dark did with a day after demonstrating what it was to an assembled world. He wrote 2 bars in his head. Then he turned and led his unit forward, and the border of the Land of Silence closed behind the last of the allied shinobi force like a sentence completing itself. Naruto stood in the empty road for a while after they left. Not watching them go, he had no need to watch. Could feel the force's withdrawal through the geology the way you feel vibration through a surface. He stood in the road because the road was where he had been, and there was no particular urgency to be anywhere else. The primordial condition receded. Not completely, it never completely receded once surfaced, the way a tide that has shown what it can reach never entirely abandons that knowledge. But the second layer settled back beneath the first. The light resumed its standard relationship with conviction. The borders of him restated themselves with the comfortable clarity of a physical form knowing where it was. He walked back toward the fortress. The court was in the throne room when he entered, all of them, which was unusual. They typically dispersed to their respective functions when not formally assembled. They had, apparently, chosen to be present. He looked at them. Komori with his complete professional stillness. Jigoku with his enormous, newly quiet mass. Yamagiri in her seat with the specific patience of a century. Kurenai with her dark-adjusted red eyes and the contained energy of someone who had already started building the thing she had been asked to build. Sari, precise and alert at the room's functional edge. "Well," Yamagiri said. Her voice carried the dry warmth of someone who has been waiting for a student to return from an exam she already knew the result of. "It went as planned," Naruto said. "Better than planned," Komori said. Not a compliment, an intelligence assessment. They withdrew intact. An intact withdrawal means functional administrative structures. Functional administrative structures means the three terms have an implementation mechanism. He paused. The Nara boy will push the implementation. He's already decided to. Naruto nodded. And Kurenai's map, he asked. Drafted, Kurenai said. I can have a full documentation of the system's entry points where it takes the children, at what age, through what mechanisms, and what those mechanisms look like from the inside within 3 months. She paused. I have 15 years of it in my head. It's mostly about finding the right order to put it in. Take the time you need, Naruto said. The generation the terms allow is long enough to do it correctly. He moved toward the throne, sat. The stone received him the way it always received him, with the recognition of a material that understood its purpose. The court remained. No one moved to leave. This was also unusual. Formal assemblies ended with a clear indication that the assembly was over. This one was staying present in the way of things that wanted to be in a room together after something significant had happened. The specific social impulse of a group that had been part of something and needed a moment to simply be the group that had been part of it. Naruto understood this. He had not always understood things like this, the social language of shared experience, the need for collective acknowledgment. He had learned it imperfectly in the years of his childhood when he watched other people have it and tried to read the grammar of it from the outside. He understood it now from the inside. Sit, he said, to all of them. An invitation without ceremony, they sat. The epilogue arrived the way real endings arrived, not dramatically, not with the weight of conclusion properly announced, but in the accumulated quiet of time passing and things settling into what they were going to be. 23 years. The academy across the 5 nations had been reformed on the schedule, the terms established, not without resistance. The resistance had been extensive, and had required the specific patience of people who understood they were building over a long timeline and could not be moved by the urgency of those who preferred the current arrangement. The minimum age for enrollment had risen. The mission structure for early career, shinobi, had changed. The framing, the stories the system told about itself to the children it trained, had been rebuilt around something Kurenai Yuhai's documentation had made possible. An honest accounting of what the system was, what it asked, and what the alternatives looked like. 3 Jinchuriki had chosen release. The process of release was complicated and long and not always clean, but it was real and it was theirs, administered by the independent process the terms had specified. 3-tailed beasts moved through the world as free entities for the first time since the Sage of 6 Paths had created them. The world had opinions about this. The world's opinions over time adjusted. 6 continued, in conditions that Kurenai's documentation had helped redesign, not the weaponized containment of the old system. Something more like the Arrangement B had always had, and that the new framework had now formalized as a standard rather than an exception. Killer B wrote a verse about the day at the border. He performed it once, at a private gathering that included no recording of any kind, to an audience of 7 people who had all been there. He never performed it again. He said the verse was the right size for the audience it had. Making it larger would change what it was. Shikamaru became the 8th Hokage. He accepted this with the specific weariness of a man who had spent his career knowing he would eventually be asked to do the most troublesome possible thing and had prepared for it anyway. He administered the term's implementation with the comprehensive thoroughness of someone who had burned a page about it and was working, through administrative action, to make the burning mean something. He never visited the Land of Silence. He did not need to. The correspondence between the Hokage's office and the Land of Silence's administrative network, managed through channels that operated below chakra detection, and arrived with the specific efficiency of Komori's blood-bound system, was regular, precise, and occasionally annotated by the sovereign himself in a handwriting that was unmistakably Naruto's, and that Shikamaru kept in a separate file that he did not show anyone. Sakura visited once. She came alone, unannounced, not as a diplomatic representative, but as herself. She stood at the border for a long time before crossing it, and when she crossed it and was shown to the chamber where Naruto received people he had known before, she sat across from him and looked at him and didn't say anything for a while. He waited. He was good at waiting. "I just needed to see you," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Are you?" She stopped, started again. "That's the wrong question." "Yes," he agreed gently. "Is there a right question?" He thought about it. "You could ask if I remember," he said. "That one I can answer. Do you remember?" "Everything," he said. "All of it, the team, the missions, every person." He paused. "I remember you in the same way I remember the ramen, precisely, completely. The temperature is gone, but the shape of it is exact." She sat with this, held it in the way Kakashi had told her to hold things, alternating, not simultaneously. "That's enough," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "It is." She stayed for an hour. They talked about small things, the village, her students, a medical technique she was developing that had an interesting theoretical problem she had been turning over for months. He listened with the complete attention he gave everything. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that showed the listening was real. When she left, she paused at the door the way Kakashi had. She did not ask if he was happy. She already knew the word wasn't right. Instead, "The Land of Silence suits you," she said. "Yes," he said. "It always did." She smiled. "A real one, not managed." "I know," she said. "I think I knew it before you did." Then she left, and the fortress closed around her departure the way the land closed around everything, completely without comment. The way things that have been here longer than memory simply receive what passes through them. On the morning of what would have been his 39th birthday, Naruto sat in the throne room alone in the hour before dawn. He did this on this morning every year. Not ceremony, observation. A marker, deliberately maintained, because even things that had left time's jurisdiction kept their own reckonings of it. The date meant what it had always meant. The night his parents died, the night Konoha survived, the night a fracture opened in the fabric of what the world was made of, and something looked through it and found him. Kurama was present in the seal. As always, the fox had settled into a condition of permanent residence that bore no resemblance to the original terms of his occupancy. No longer a prisoner, no longer a power source, no longer a relationship with clear roles. Something that had run out of categories and was simply what it was. Kurama inside Naruto, as it had been from 3 minutes after birth. As it would be, apparently, indefinitely. 39, Kurama said. By the count we started with, 39, Naruto agreed. The boy on the roof was 7. Yes, that's 32 years since the rice bowl, you're counting. I have nothing but time, Kurama said. I count things. A pause. He would have been something, the fox said, if the world had been different. If someone had looked at him earlier, he would have been, I don't know what, something that didn't require all of this to get here, maybe, Naruto said. Or maybe this was always the shape of it and the path was just the path. He paused. I stopped being able to tell the difference between what was inevitable and what was chosen a long time ago. Does it matter? He considered. No, he said. I think it doesn't. The dawn arrived in the land of silence the way it always arrived. Not dramatically, not with the warm, golden arrival of clear sky mornings, but as a gradual shift in the quality of the overcast. The cloud cover moving from opaque to translucent. The diffused light of a sun that was present but not directly visible spreading through the gray in slow, even increments. It was a dawn that did not announce itself. It simply arrived and was present and continued. Naruto watched it. He was thinking about ramen. He thought about it most mornings, especially this morning, especially the hour before dawn when the silence was its most complete and the old memory was closest to the surface. Chuchai's counter, the steam, the red curtain, the specific ritual of a bowl that was too hot, eaten slowly to make it last, the one uncomplicated good thing. He had not gone back. He would not go back. Not because it was impossible. The land of silence's sovereignty did not prohibit him from traveling, and nothing in the shinobi world could prevent him from going anywhere he chose to go. Because the going back would do something to the memory, and the memory was worth more than the ramen. The ramen was, by now, a kind of ramen that no physical bowl could replicate. It was the ramen of a 7-year-old on a roof in autumn finding one genuine thing in a day of difficult things. That ramen existed only where he kept it. Taking it out of the keeping and trying to make it real again would make it something other than what it was, so he kept it. He would always keep it. The one human thing left in him, held in the place where human things were stored, carefully and permanently, as if to say, I remember where I came from. I remember what it cost. I remember the temperature even though I can't feel it anymore. The pre-chakra scars in the land of silence's geology breathed their slow, millennial breath around him. The fortress held its impossible architecture against the dawn. The court was elsewhere in the structure, Komori running the intelligence network's morning cycle, Jigoku doing whatever Jigoku did in the hours before he was needed, Yamagiri studying the texts she had spent a century accumulating and was still finding new things in, Kurenai reviewing correspondence from the Academy reform committees, Sari at her security rounds with the thoroughness of someone who took thoroughness seriously. His court, his land, his condition. The world outside was doing what the world did, reforming slowly around the terms of its new reality, as it always reformed around any new reality, with friction and resistance, and the eventual capitulation of things that persist in the face of something that simply continues. The 5 nations were building. Shikamaru was administering. Children were being enrolled later. Jinchuriki were being asked what they wanted, which was new and difficult and producing outcomes that the old system's designers would not have predicted. And that Naruto found, when Komori's reports brought him the data, consistently more interesting than the old system's outcomes had been. The world was not better yet. It was better facing, which was the prerequisite for better, and which was more than it had been. It was enough. It was the correct amount of enough for where they currently were. Naruto sat in the throne room as the land of silence's dawn completed itself, and felt the geological patience of his land around him, and held a rice ball memory in the place where temperature used to live, and was not happy. He had told Kakashi accurately that the aperture for happiness had changed, but correct. Fully, permanently, exactly correct. A thing in its right place, doing what it existed to do, surrounded by what had recognized it first. The sun rose above the overcast without becoming visible. The light arrived anyway. The eternal eclipse held and held and held. And the primordial sovereign sat in his throne at the beginning of another day that would last as long as days lasted, which was as long as he decided they did, which was as long as needed. Which was, in the end, what forever had always meant. End of chapter 6.